CD 7.
Father Etienne invited them inside his office with an extended palm, kissing Marie-Catherine on the cheek and then turning to Angelina, his arms open to embrace her. He recalled her as a small child, he declared, smiling. You used to wander around the sacristy gardens, pulling the petals off my roses, chasing the pigeons.
I rather like gardening now,
said Angelina. She glanced at Marie-Catherine from beneath her eyelashes, resentful at being forced to part company with her herbs. Though not for long. She made a sound of appreciation, stepping into the large room and examining the priest's bookcases. Like the shelves in Marie-Catherine's chamber, they were packed with fascinating tomes and volumes. But where she collected Greek and Roman fables, and French novels, verses and plays, Father Etienne sought the subjects of theology, philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. He possessed editions that had been hand-copied by scribes, dating to before the printing presses, he boasted. Angelina nodded, widening her eyes to show her approval. Without asking permission, she lifted a Renaissance bestiary from behind its glass case and began to leaf through the vellum pages. I think that one has marginalia, said Father Etienne in a confidential tone, towards the back. The monks used to grow bored and scribble jokes.
I don't doubt it, she said, turning to the back of the book. Oh!
Some are a little bawdy, remarked Father Etienne, amused. My apologies. Angelina returned the book to the shelf and pointed to a volume about medicine. A herbarium.
Perhaps I might borrow this one?
As long as you take care turning the pages. There could be herbs pressed inside.
Really?
Said Angelina, disbelieving. She glanced at the priest and saw that he was making a little joke of his own. Marie-Catherine let her breath out in relief. Angelina was viewing the priest as a person, not simply a member of the clergy. It was only a month ago that her daughter had shocked her into near speechlessness, confessing that she detested Catholicism and everything it stood for. Your mother tells me you've had nursing training. Angelina thumbed the index, her lips pressed into a concentrated line.
I'd love to keep my skills. This would be such a help.
A hopeful note entered her voice. The Baron's ill, interjected Marie-Catherine. Angelina's been mixing cure-alls.
You don't have to whisper, Maman. It's no secret.
Angelina was granted permission to continue perusing the priest's library. Settling in behind his desk, Father Etienne invited Marie-Catherine to be seated. He was as incorrigible as she was, acquiring an assortment of fine writing tools, enamel, ivory, jade, marquisite, and a handsome little curio cabinet. His other indulgences decorated the walls and enlivened his reading corner. Medieval candlesticks, Roman vases, Moorish tablecloths. Persian rugs softened the flagstones, everything dusted and ordered and seen to by his loyal housekeeper. How sparse and small and plain his former office had been. Preoccupied, Angelina deposited herself, somewhat gracelessly, in the chair beside Marie-Catherine. She lifted the basket onto the priest's desk and removed the pastries they had brought to share. Shaking open a handkerchief, she wrapped the medical texts, she decided to borrow 3, in the cloth and packed them inside, placing the basket on the floor at her feet. What new-found confidence her daughter expressed. Her boldness in helping herself to the priest's belongings created a barrier between mother and daughter. Marie-Catherine had far too much reserve to run her hands over Father Etienne's possessions. She hoped her daughter was not causing offence. But Father Etienne was unconcerned, and they needn't have packed a luncheon to share. When it appeared the housekeeper, was as attentive as any wife. The brown-eyed woman entered the office, laying out a tray of cheese, bread, and steaming hot tea. Father Etienne poured them all a cup of tea, asking Angelina about leaving St. Anne's, turning away from the life of a religious. Her daughter responded to Father Etienne's queries with resistance, unwilling to discuss her feelings with a priest. A polite silence descended, and Father Etienne met Marie-Catherine's gaze, sensing her need to raise the topic the meeting had been arranged to address. He had written to inform her he'd been appointed as Madame Tiquet's chaplain at the Petit Châtelet and undertaken his first visit. Feeling the hairs on her arms prickle, Marie-Catherine asked after Nicola's welfare. Though through the day she kept her imagination in check regarding Nicola's imprisonment, at night she dreamed of her in her cell, half deranged, thin and unwashed, pacing about inside the cold walls, muttering and cursing at shadows. Father Etienne laced his fingers together and gently shook his head. She fares remarkably well in the circumstances. Although there was a period of adjustment, I spoke to the head warden. Her last visitor smuggled in a sleeping potion, and she drank the bottle in one sitting. She was found the next morning soaked in vomit and urine. "Good God," muttered Marie-Catherine. She began to twist her rings. The priest cleared his throat, his eyes moving to the crucifix hanging on the wall beside the window. "I gave the warden the coin you provided. She's a tough case, and was firm with her. She's agreed to keep a close watch over our friend." "How can you say that she's well adjusted?" "Her conditions could be far worse. Although her cell is small, it's adequate. It's clean. She was in prayer when I was let in, crouching on the bare floor, before a table with a candle burning. It warmed my heart. I said Mass with her, and she was very grateful. We spoke a little of her son and husband." "Did she mention my letter?" asked Marie-Catherine, concerned that Nicola might be angry at her. After all, with her thoughtless advice on the night of the salon, she had, in a sense, set the events of her incarceration in motion. "Yes, she did, as a matter of fact. She's relieved you've taken over from Madame de Senonville. I sensed she feels abandoned by her former companion, though I thought better of pressing her for details. I did broach the incident of the sleeping draught, primarily to ascertain the state of her soul." "She must be in agony," said Marie-Catherine, biting hard on her lip, drawing blood. "Perhaps it'll all turn out for the best in the end. It seems to have been a turning point for her. She has made peace with our Lord. She has accepted her circumstances. We talked about forgiveness. It was not pleasant. I had to remind her that self-slaughter is a sin, but she did not resist the conversation, which must have been upsetting for her. Her faith is strong, and she maintains her innocence. Her hope that in the eyes of the law she shall not be found wanting." "She cannot give up. I won't allow it. She must fight," said Marie-Catherine. "I do not disagree," reflected Father Etienne, "but a case can be made for peaceful acceptance of one's circumstances." "Perhaps it's an act," suggested Marie-Catherine, scratching her chin. "I find it very hard to believe she's resigned to her fate." Father Etienne chewed his cheek, considering. "No, I do not think so," he said. "I could see it in her eyes. She is stronger than you think." She should be reassured by the priest's report, even if it were a brief reprieve. There was no new word in the newspapers of developments in the state's case against Madame Tiquet, and she held a fear that she would be left to wither in her cell. There must be more they could do for her. "What do you think of asking the Archbishop to intervene with the authorities?" she suggested. "The police guards on her house are expensive, and they've proven themselves untrustworthy, though she insists on keeping them in place. Her fears of Monsieur Tiquet making a claim on her possessions overrides all sense, and she has a son to care for. What's the purpose of her being locked up when there's no case for her to answer?" "Ah, but there is," said Father Etienne, swallowing. "That's a good idea, though. I'm willing to begin a petition. But do not overestimate the parish's powers within the city."
"Surely the circumstances of the case warrant the Church's involvement," interrupted Marie-Catherine, "and the public's interest. The wives of Paris are on her side for a start."
Angelina narrowed her eyes and turned to face Marie-Catherine.
"I wouldn't raise any hopes the Church will lift a finger for her. When has the institution concerned itself with the well-being of its female faithful?" She smiled at the priest. "With the exception of you, perhaps, Father."
"Angelina!" Marie-Catherine bowed her head in shame, though deep down she agreed with her daughter's sentiments and was begrudgingly impressed by Angelina's candidness. Father Etienne ignored the comment. He spoke for several more minutes about Nicolas Tiquet and the next visit the priest would make.
"I'm sorry I cannot travel to the Petit Châtelet myself," Marie-Catherine said. "You understand my position."
She gave him a meaningful look. The priest shook his head. "Do not trouble yourself. You're doing all you can." He glanced into her eyes, knowing the reason for her reluctance, the risk it would mean to her status as a resident of Paris. She could not afford to rouse the authorities' suspicions. She assuaged her guilt, handing over the letter she had written for Father Etienne to deliver to Nicolas. It was filled with encouraging sentiment, copied lines of prayer, and a renewed pledge to honour their friendship. Mere words, which at that moment felt inadequate and trite and empty. But she would not give up. She would find a way to help Nicolas. Nicolas, 23rd of May. A black-headed gull landed on the sill of the barred window of Nicolas' cell. It must have strayed off course. Its scarlet legs should have been balanced on a fisherman's haul net, scarlet beak digging into the gelled eye or exposed belly of a bream or carp. The dark hood was unmistakable, like a friar's cap, contrasting with its sleek white body. Unmistakable as the scarlet stockings and blue doublets of the city police, come to free her from her cell the previous day. Nicolas had not dreamed the intrusive glance of the broader of the two guards, as she wrapped her hair and took Marthe's rosary into her hands. She pressed a bead between her fingers and closed her eyes while the irons were locked around her wrists and ankles. Staunchly braced between the heft of their wool-shrouded shoulders, she was marched down the corridors of the Petit Châtelet. Again she was helped to climb into the back of a police conveyance. She had not invented the smell of horse manure, the dark sparkle of the Seine, the tall bell towers of Notre Dame, nor the little girl running in circles around her brother. The sun's light pricked her eyes, and her nose ran. Not like this, she recalled thinking. She had expected crowds of cheering Parisians welcoming her release, her homecoming. She had asked for help covering her mouth as the city's slaughterhouses reared into view, the stench of blood and curing meat clogging her throat. But she feasted her sights on the outdoor market, 100 marquees, orange and white striped awnings, identical stalls, the vendors selling offal and silver-blue cuts of meat, arguing prices, their aprons blood-soaked and buzzing with flies. A pig ran under the cart's wheels. A file of asses bearing heavy panniers stepped past so closely that if she were not restrained she might reach over and pat a warm grey rump. she'd been transferred to the most feared prison in Paris, the Grand Châtelet, seat of the city's municipal court. She had offered silent thanks that she possessed coin to enable her to pay a private charge for a pistole cell, which had a bed and table, and was not forced, like the miserable poor, to inhabit one of the notorious secret cells in the underground basements. Tiny cells were lodged inside the stairwells, some no more than 6 feet square in size, into which 5 prisoners were packed like salted herrings. But these were not the worst. The below-ground dens were wet the year round, the tidal waters of the Seine seeping through small gaps in the stones, no light and no ventilation. And then there was the pit, reserved for the most contemptible prisoners, who were lowered in a bucket into a well, where they sat with their feet dipped in water, unable to stand or lie down. Reptiles and vermin slithered on the walls, and a man was said to survive no more than 15 days under the conditions. By noon, when the police guards entered her new cell, summoning her to the criminal chamber for her trial, the bird was long gone. Would she, too, gain her freedom? She held out a small hope that justice would be served, though it was not as strong as the fear that had settled over her heart, filling her veins like a poison. She would turn herself to the Lord, use His strength to face her ordeal. Calling upon His help, she bade her trembling fingers to still, as again she held out her wrists for the iron collars to be fastened. The hem of her skirt caught a rough edge on the corner of the door as she was bundled through, but she was unruffled. She kept her head held high, her shoulders rolled back. It seemed like forever that she travelled between the 2 wardens, along the dark, stinking corridors, and up the narrow, spiralling staircases to the ground level of the prison, where the court was located. She cast her eyes downwards, made her limbs mobile and yielding, her attention on the flags moving beneath her shoes, the rosary beads hard as grinding stones between her fingers. Her trial was already underway when she entered the unheated courtroom. It was to be a closed hearing, if the empty public gallery was any indication. She drew in a ragged breath and steeled herself against a fresh wave of terror. She tried not to think about Marie-Catherine's promises to help her. Her friend had smuggled coin to the police, for which she was deeply thankful, but it appeared that the Baroness would not be making her presence known as a witness during her trial. She had perhaps asked too much of her, presumed without any real knowledge her ability to come to her aid, and nor were Mat de Senonville, Marguerite Dunoyer, or any of her other salon acquaintances in attendance. She had not expected Gilbert to be there, although catching even the briefest glimpse of his sweet face would have helped to calm her churning insides. No, she had been abandoned by all who purported to love her, left alone to face the machinery of the justice system. With nothing but her own strong will, her soft woman's voice for her defence. She stole a glance at the bailiff, perched like an eagle on his carved eyrie, the wooden surface littered with inkpot, quills and papers, the magistrate and procureur-general conferred to his left at the bar, their heavy wigs and detested scarlet robes signalling officialdom, the punitive authority of the state. She was marched past the empty public benches and brought to a halt several steps from a chained convict. Tall and broad-shouldered, the fabric of his ill-fitting tunic thin with overuse, his exposed scalp a patch of black-grey stubble. A guard crouched at his ankles, twisting a lock in the fetters attached to an iron ring mounted in a stone pillar. 2 more police perched at his side, their bodies tense as sheepdogs, trained on their prisoner's movements. She was close enough to count the moles on his bare arms, the long black hairs on the backs of his hands. Even from behind, and without his expensive livery, she had recognized immediately the form of Jacques Mouet. He had possessed an eye for detail, laundering his doublet and breeches from his own purse, his cravat impeccably knotted, his cheeks and chin close shaved and rubbed with pomade. In her service, he had overseen the male serving staff, navigating the intricacies of directing the men of his rank. The police investigation had somehow sniffed out his whereabouts, had already subjected him to private interrogations. Green and purple shadows darkened his eyes, a handprint marked his throat, and there was swelling beneath his cheekbones. She fought to conceal her emotions, staunching the self-pity that threatened to betray her with tears by wrapping the rosary tightly around her knuckles. She found his eyes. His expression seemed to plead with her, a secret communication in which she imagined he asked her forgiveness. For appearing before her, broken and reduced, for failing in his duties, both large and small. Nicola had not instructed him to disappear, and had certainly not known his location. If only he had come to her, taken her into his confidence. Jacques, whose towering height had helped her sleep, who had protected her during her husband's rages. She recalled the night he had entered her bedchamber, wishing to personally deliver the key he had forged, so that she might regain a small degree of freedom. He had contrived to steal the original from under her husband's nose, called in a favour from a locksmith friend to have it duplicated. She longed to turn her head and watch her former servant being led from the courtroom, but disciplined herself to submit to being chained to the dock in his place. She made a study of the portrait of King Louis, his podgy cheeks and pouting pigeon's chest, his blue hose and ermine-trimmed gown, his oil-black eyes seeming to return her gaze. Their prisoner secured, the guards retreated to the back of the room. Able to think without their foul breath in her nostrils, she readied herself to answer the bailiff's address. The trial was resuming. A court official held out a Bible, upon which she stated her name, age, and rank, as well as her pledge to speak the truth, so help her God. Acting on some unseen directive, another official entered the courtroom, delivering to the bailiff's desk a thick dossier, inside which was collected the evidence pertaining to the charges that had been laid against her. Besides the criminal court, the Grand Châtelet operated 3 other offices of the law, the civil, municipal, and presidential chambers. Her husband was employed as an official in the civil court, and daily carried out this duty of searching through depositions, warrants, inventories and interrogations brought to the magistrates and procurers for inspection, before being passed on to the busy bailiff. Although this was her first appearance in a criminal court, some years before she had lodged a suit in the civil chamber against Monsieur Tiquet for fraud and the mishandling of her finances. Despite Claude's familiarity with the judicial bureaucracy, the findings were awarded in her favour. Along with vindication and the protection of her inheritance, the experience proved affirmation of her personal conviction that her husband would not rise through the ranks of his employment. It brought a new suspicion, too, that her husband was as thoroughly disliked in his place of work as he was in her household. Now she wondered what damning testimonies they had amassed against her good name. What had Jacques been forced to admit? She glanced at the judge, trying to ascertain his mood, but it was futile. The tall, elderly man was fussily officious, his expression opaque. The dossier would most certainly hold a record of the separation of the Tiquet's effects. Perhaps a maid or kitchen hand had spoken of her demanding temper. But if she knew her husband, it would not contain any mention of the lettre de cachet he had brought to her chambers, signed by the hand of the king. Not long after their financial holdings were divided, and they took up separate apartments in her home, Claude had travelled to Versailles to speak with the sovereign about a private matter. He had lined up with the horde of petitioners gathered in the hope of being granted a royal intervention into a business or domestic dispute. Following his audience, of which she was unaware, Claude had asked to meet with her privately to discuss their son's tutor. Her lady's maid was asked to leave, although Jacques was requested to stay outside the door, as was their arrangement, for Claude could not always master his temper. Barely able to contain his excitement, her husband waved the letter with its distinctive royal seal under her eyes. His voice raised to a pitch. Guessing he had tricked her, she refused to read its contents. He removed himself to a chair near the fireplace, resting his foot on its upholstery, deliberately invoking her ire, and ceremoniously unfolded the document. The lettre de cachet detailed a sentence: that she be sent to a convent for the duration of 2 years, in punishment for conducting an affair with a favourite of the King's Guard, Monsieur Gilbert Montgeorges. When she understood what Claude had set in motion, she was so angry that for a moment she could not take a breath. After everything she had done for him, his entitlement, she permitted him to remain living in her home, was staggering. Again she was shocked at his lack of foresight and mortified that it had taken several years to realize she had married, of her own volition, a fool. If Claude were a nobleman with bushels of coin, perhaps his inspiration might have succeeded. But on his wage he could not hope to afford the fee of consigning her to a convent, and she would not put a sou of her personal funds towards her own imprisonment. Never would his idea have succeeded. And then it dawned on her that his true intention had been simply to provoke her into a rage, the only power he retained in their marriage. Secure in the knowledge that Jacques listened at the chamber door, she pretended a desire to examine the king's correspondence with her own eye, and when the paper was given to her, she threw it onto the fire and watched it burn to a shriveled crisp. She had folded her arms and faced him, proud that she had managed to bite her tongue, proud that she did not dress him down about his shortcomings, her myriad disappointments in his conduct. She would not give him the satisfaction of watching her so reduced. Empurpled with fury, he strode from her chamber in a sulk. Come the next petitioning day at the palace, he again took his place for an audience with King Louis. But the sovereign had been unimpressed with his lack of control over his wife, and he was sent from the chamber empty-handed, thoroughly humiliated. She rubbed her sweating hands against the rough stone pillar. The Procureur General collected his papers, preparing to address the courtroom. Madame Nicolas Carlier-Tiquet, you are to be tried today under the law of Blois for organising a conspiracy of men to murder your husband, Monsieur Claude Tiquet. He read a statement detailing the charges that had been brought against her by Claude, as reported to the Lieutenant Criminal on the 6th of April, 1699. While the state has failed to gather evidence to tie the defendant to the murder attempt on that date, a new charge involving another plot against the life of Monsieur Claude Tiquet has been filed in your name. The witness in the case turned himself in to the city police on the 20th of May, citing a troubled conscience. The evidence tendered in these new charges, which you must answer in this court, has enabled your trial to proceed. Nicola cast her eyes to a shadowy corner of the room, where the bailiff gestured with his hand. She had been so preoccupied with her terror that she had not noticed the witness, waiting patiently for his evidence to be presented. The fellow had been in the courtroom all along, coiled in the poorly lit stand, quiet as a vole. It would be his word against hers. Perhaps she still stood a chance, she thought, taking in his form.
He appeared a thorough ruffian, thinning grey hair, a stout muscular body. He had a wild light in his eyes, for he had come alive, hearing his name called, and uncurled himself, standing tall and rigid, as if in some tired bone of his dilapidated old body he recalled a prior military training. His chin raised, his face appeared to glow. He spoke his name, meeting the eyes of all in the courtroom, affecting the pride of the fanatically religious, or perhaps a common lunacy. He dramatically rolled his shoulders. It was ridiculous how he comported himself. A debonair seriousness came over his face, destroyed by the single yellowing tooth that remained in his hole of a mouth. He was unshaven, his clothes patched and re-sewn until they resembled no more than rags. Perhaps if he acted in line with his appearance, he would not be so discreditable. 3 years ago, in the summer of 1696, began the procurer, speaking on Catalin's behalf, as was the legal procedure, you organised with your husband's valet, Jacques Mouet, the amount of 100 silver écus to be paid to Augustus Catalin for the assassination of Monsieur Claude Tiquet. She locked her gaze on the back wall, moving her fingers along her rosary beads. Hail Mary, full of grace, she whispered as he spoke. Finished the prayer, she levelled her gaze with the judges. I deny the charge, Your Honour. The bailiff continued. You are accused of involvement in a conspiracy to arrange for a party of 15 men, soldiers, lackeys and coachmen, to carry out an attack on Monsieur Tiquet, journeying on foot to his home on Thursday evening, the 7th of June, in the year 1696. How do you plead to this charge? Give us this day our daily bread, she prayed, feverish. When she had finished reciting the prayer, she answered firmly, Not guilty. Her voice was clear and resolute. I know not a shred of detail concerning this plot. She dropped her eyes, her face without expression. The procureur put it to her that she had promised more funds to Catalin and his band of men once the assassination had been successfully orchestrated. I did no such thing, she said, moving her fingers to clasp the next bead. She also denied the subsequent assertion that, with the plan to ambush the victim failed, the fatal blow fallen short of its mark and the conspiracy abandoned, she made threats to kill Catalin should he breathe a word of the plan to any person. The procureur droned on, tabling the accusation that she had persisted in her illegal scheming, instructing the valet to communicate to Catalin that a further sum of money would be offered to bury all talk of the attempt on Monsieur's life, that he was to lay low for the moment, but to be prepared for a future assignment. Between every charge levelled at her, to which she was required to give a verbal affirmation or denial, she muttered the prayer for the next bead before giving her answer again and again, over and over. Not guilty. The trial was nearing its conclusion. She had prayed a full decade of the Rosary, but there remained one final charge to answer to. Closing her eyes, she drew in a weary, controlled breath. She was determined not to be broken. In the name of God, I deny everything, Your Honour. Not a single word is true. Part 3. Angelina, the 1st of June. A shiver passed beneath Angelina's skin. She studied the pair of nursing sisters who were dressed in their pitch and ivory tunics and headdresses, consoling the huddled queues waiting at the entrance to the city morgue. Permitted their turn to enter the below-ground viewing room, the city's abandoned and bereaved would peer in solemn trepidation at the rows of corpses laid out on slabs.
the clothing and possessions found with the deceased pegged to a post behind them, as if they had taken a jacket off upon returning home. Once, Angelina had wished to join the Daughters of St. Catherine, dedicating her life to the welfare of the poor. She would graduate from training, able to assist in all matter of maladies in a large hospital. Her apprenticeship starting here at the Grand Châtelet by learning to wash and prepare the unidentified dead found in the city streets and drowned in the Seine. She clutched Marie-Catherine's elbow tightly under her arm. Lifting the hems of their gowns, they stepped over the washed cobbles, moving towards the small assembly of guards, acquaintances, and friends of Nicolas Tiquet at the opposite end of the courtyard. Madame Tiquet's trial had concluded, and she had been sentenced, the verdict posted to the public notice board outside the Châtelet courthouse. Marie-Catherine stiffened.
"What's the matter now?"
asked Angelina.
"The fellow in the blue vest. Do you see him?"
she whispered. Angelina glanced in the direction her mother was pointing her cane. A gentleman of middling height and fine facial features, a shock of black hair, had turned away from the notice board. His gloved hand covered his mouth, and his eyes raked the crowd. It took a moment for Angelina to recognize who he was, although his face had been sketched many times in the Paris broadsheets. She had never met Madame Tiquet's husband, Claude. His companion, it must be Villemain, the loyal cousin, was tall and graceful. She watched him bend his head and whisper into Monsieur Tiquet's ear, which only seemed to further provoke the fellow. Nostrils flaring, he whipped his head from side to side, the whites of his eyes rounded like those of a startled horse.
"Why would that Tiquet bastard show his face here?"
"Pay him no attention, Maman,"
said Angelina, forcing a neutrality she did not feel into her voice. She was tempted to say they might be attending the Châtelet on worse business, but decided it was better to keep the thoughts private. She had tried to talk her mother out of making an especial journey to learn Nicolas' sentence. There would be no escaping the news. But Marie-Catherine was determined. A week ago, she had received word from Father Etienne that an announcement by the Procureur General was imminent, and so every morning for the past 4 days her mother had dragged her aching, complaining limbs into a carriage and set off, Angelina at her side, hoping for news.
"You're treading on my foot,"
said Angelina. Standing in the place Monsieur Tiquet had vacated only moments earlier, Angelina struggled to find the verdict among the pinned documents, all sealed with the stamp of the Châtelet. The fate of Nicolas Tiquet was the subject of the month in every class of Parisian household. Bets were laid in gambling dens as to which side of justice the scales would fall. Children sang and clapped rhymes, dramatizing her misbehaviour. But plenty more prisoners had been sentenced for misdemeanours, and more. Desiring to put off confirming the worst, she was not looking forward to her mother's reaction. Angelina let herself be caught up reading the sentences of a bankrupt surgeon found to have infected several patients with gangrene, and a boatswain who had mislaid, feared lost, no less than 17 wheels of aged cheese. Marie-Catherine had already scanned the contents of the ruling, pulling at Angelina's sleeve to help her make her way out of the stifling, excited crowd. Begging her mother's patience, she began to read the magistrate's flourishing script. That the municipal court, being satisfied with the proof of Madame Carlier, wife of Monsieur Tiquet, and Jacques Mouet, former valet to the said Tiquet, having entered into a conspiracy for his assassination, and of the said ladies dispersing several considerable sums to the said Mouet and other accomplices, and of their receiving such sums, and acting according to that lady's directions, for which they have adjudged the said Madame Tiquet to suffer on a scaffold by having her head struck off, and the said Mouet to suffer by being hanged on a gallows, to be erected at the said place by the neck till he be dead, and afterwards to remain on the gibbet of Paris 24 hours, all their effects to be confiscated, and 100,000 livres to be taken out of the effects of Madame Tiquet and paid to her husband, of which he is to have the use during his life, proper security being taken that the said sum shall descend, whole and untouched, to his child of this marriage, that before the execution both Madame Tiquet and Mouet shall endure torture, ordinary and extraordinary, in order to discover who were their accomplices, and to furnish authentic proof against those who are already suspected and in custody. That, given the capital nature of the crime, the sentence by the criminal court be granted lawful appeal, a stay of execution upheld until the final binding judgment of the High Court at Parliament. Marie-Catherine expressed her frustration by striking her cane several times against the stone ramparts of the court building, until Angelina noticed a police official hurrying towards them, a hand on the hilt of his sword. She steered her towards the stinking Butcher's Row marketplace, where a jumble of battered carriages waited for temporary hire. Their return journey to the apartment was grim. Marie-Catherine would not let her open the curtains, and neither would she part her lips to offer her opinion of Nicola's verdict. Angelina asked if she thought Nicola had been informed of the news herself, to which she replied with little more than a rude grunt. Determined to brood, Marie-Catherine drew her charcoal brows low over her slitted eyes. She pinched and squeezed her fingers with such force that Angelina dreaded tending them later. She would need to double the ointment and soak them in warm lavender water. Every once in a while, Marie-Catherine banged the cane against the carriage door, until Angelina feared the carriage would be stopped, and they would be put out on the street in an unknown neighbourhood. She could not wait to deposit her mother home and escape her company. But they returned to Marie-Catherine's chamber to be greeted by a pile of correspondence, her mother protesting that she was in no condition to concentrate on reading. Might Angelina inform her of any missives needing her immediate attention? The letter from her Dutch publisher could wait. However, the package from Monsieur Matthias Carlier, Nicola's brother, must be unwrapped then and there. Angela unfolded the parcel, shaking out a veil of white Italian lace and remarking upon its delicacy. There was a letter tucked inside. "Open it," said Marie-Catherine, sitting on the chaise and nervously touching her head wrap. Angelina eyed the script. "Monsieur Carlier sends his apologies for his late response to your inquiry. He was away from his Paris barracks and his estate in Léon, on the road with the king." She read ahead. "He begs your indulgence as his messengers did not forward your letter. He was not aware of your friendship with Nicola." Matthias Carlier wrote that he had undertaken to make a campaign on behalf of his sister's life. The Duchess of Burgundy, a great friend of the king's and his own family, had petitioned Louis for a royal pardon, as had he, his wife, and several of their circle of friends. But their efficacy was made complicated by Nicola's romantic association with Matthias's colleague Gilbert Montgeorges. The matter was most delicate indeed. Montgeorges had almost fallen out with the king over the scandal. Several days before Monsieur Carlier made his appeal to King Louis, Gilbert Montgeorges had sought his own private audience. Rumours had been circulating in the ranks of the king's guard about Montgeorges's possible involvement in the conspiracy to murder Monsieur Tiquet. "Marie-Catherine must understand," wrote Matthias, "that Montgeorges was a gentleman of impeccable honour, his loyalty to his king and his country unquestioned. Several years ago, during the incident of the lettre de cachet, the king had taken personal counsel with Montgeorges, advising him that the scandal around Nicola and her husband's accusation of adultery threatened to mar his flawless record of service. The king would not pass a judgment on Gilbert's private conduct, but he advised his guard unequivocally to cease his relationship with Nicola Tiquet. Montgeorges had obeyed the king's instruction, severing his attachment to Matthias's sister. Nevertheless, despite no longer calling himself a friend of Madame Tiquet, Montgeorges had made an appeal to the king to show mercy in her case, putting himself at personal and professional risk. Not wishing to be involved, the king responded by issuing him with 3 months' forced leave from the king's guard. "You must understand, Madame d'Aulnoy, how difficult it has been for my family to intervene in my sister's case. I have had to protect my own interests and approach her fate through clandestine arrangements, and I do not exaggerate when I write that it has been difficult to find individuals loyal and willing to help in Nicola's time of need. I can count them on one hand. If you could pass the veil on to dear Nicola, our mother wore it on her wedding day, I should be eternally in your debt. Send her my love, and tell her she is in Montgeorges' heart. He has passed on a small note for her. Perhaps you might enclose it with the veil. I shall be ever grateful." "I cannot feign why he bothered to write to me," muttered Marie-Catherine. "He's only trying to ease his wretched conscience."
"So, Monsieur Tiquet's accusation of adultery was correct?" asked Angelina. "I thought they were just rumours. You made it sound as if he invented it all. She's caused deep trouble for her family."
"I did not think to concern you with the details. Montgeorges helped Nicola to endure her horrid marriage. He's practically a saint. He's certainly no bed-hopping chevalier. Until very recently I'd been under the impression she was finished with him."
"I can hardly believe it," said Angelina. "Why did you keep this from me? I do not understand why you insist on helping her."
"I did not think it necessary to involve you. Please, Angie, you're not to speak of it to a soul. It's a private matter," said Marie-Catherine. Seizing the letter from Angelina and glancing at the fire, she stopped short of throwing it into the flames.
"I think it's gone beyond the walls of Madame Tiquet's boudoir. Besides, who on earth do you imagine I'd confide in?" asked Angelina. "It's not as if I have any influential Parisian friends."
"All the same," said Marie-Catherine, her voice weary. Over a luncheon of beef, beans and potatoes, Marie-Catherine pondered aloud how to respond to Nicola's sentencing. "I cannot believe she's been found guilty of a conspiracy planned 3 whole years ago and which was not even carried out. It's nothing less than outrageous."
"You've put much effort into helping her," observed Angelina. "Perhaps it's time to let things go? This whole sad affair has interfered with your writing. You've abandoned your new idea. All your fretting is keeping you up at night. I hear you, pacing about the floorboards. Perhaps it's the right moment to accept the verdict of the state."
Marie-Catherine put down her fork. She looked at Angelina, her eyes flashing. "I shall do nothing of the sort. I am certainly not ready to hang up my hat. It's all because of that damned servant Jacques Mouet. He's the one with the grievance against Monsieur Tiquet. Nicola told me as much. Her so-called accomplice, that Catalan fellow, your father wrote to me about him, is utterly discreditable, a common criminal. I fail to understand why his word has been held up as true against Nicola's. She is an upstanding citizen, with a fortune to her name. It makes no sense."
"But what can you do, Maman? You're no lawyer. You do not have friends at the Grand Châtelet. Her husband works there, for goodness sake. They are probably protecting him."
Marie-Catherine gazed at Angelina for a long moment. Angelina could almost see the thoughts wheeling behind her dark brown eyes. She seemed to have an idea. Finished lunch, Marie-Catherine bade Angelina to sit at her desk and cut a new quill. She was to copy down her mother's dictation. For a moment, Angelina's hopes rose that Marie-Catherine had taken her advice and was going to work on her new story idea, that after luncheon she had been fortified, even if just for an afternoon, to push the TK business from her thoughts. "There's still time," said Marie-Catherine, her voice quickening in excitement. "I think I have found an answer. We shall do exactly what the court has done, except in the favour of elevating Nicola TK's name rather than tearing it down. I am going to write a pamphlet about her. I am going to list all her many good works. She is the benefactress of one of the biggest orphanages in Paris. Perhaps the state needs reminding of precisely whom they seek to condemn. She descends from the Carlier publishing fortune. She has a flawless mental character. If no one else will come forward in her defence, it shall have to be me. I know all about her husband's mistreatment, and I'll bet you she has not been able to have that side of the case heard in the courts. They do not allow representation. That fraudulent dupe of a husband used to lock her in her rooms. He stole money from her, manhandled her, he tried to drown her. I'll wager you didn't know that. This afternoon we're going to set to work, writing down a strong testimony to speak of her good name. Oh, I should have done this weeks ago." "It seems a long bow to draw," observed Angelina, resigned. "But worth a try, I suppose." Marie-Catherine wrung her hands. "The woman deserves justice. My Dutch publisher, Alberts, is coming to Paris in a week, and I'm going to ask him to print the testimony into a pamphlet. We can circulate it in all the best political and literary salons. We shall collect signatures, and when it's ready, I shall have it delivered to the magistrates of the Grand Châtelet." Her determination renewed, Marie-Catherine called Sophie into the room and had her stoke the fire hot. Angelina opened a fresh notebook, admiring the cleverness of the last part of her mother's plan. She would anonymously author the document, then have it printed in Amsterdam and shipped back to Paris, evading the royal censor. Marie-Catherine, overtaken by the spirit of seeking justice for her dear friend, fretted and schemed and solved. Soon she had formulated the structure of the entire pamphlet. She would begin by reminding the city's residents of Nicola's high rank, the tragic loss of her parents. The lady in question was the daughter of a publisher named Carlier, who had bequeathed her 500,000 livres, and the same to her brother, who was a captain in the Guards. She became an orphan when she was 15. Perched at Marie-Catherine's desk, Angelina wrote until her fingers cramped, trying to keep up with the furious pace of her mother's thoughts. The document completed, she made Angelina list every acquaintance they could think of who might put their name forward in support of Madame Tiquet's good reputation. By mid-afternoon, Marie-Catherine was slumped in her chair, exhausted. The pain of her affliction had returned, the joints in her feet and hands filled with a dull throbbing.
"You must rest, Maman," advised Angelina. "This morning's news has been a shock."
Worried, she called in Sophie to remove Marie-Catherine's stockings and walk her over to the bed, helping to ease her under the blankets. Fearing her mother would not be able to rest, she went to the kitchen to make up a sleeping balm and a fresh batch of ointment for her arthritis. She spent an hour soothing away her mother's pains, gently massaging the reddened skin covering her aching bones, only ceasing when she was sure her breathing had slowed and she was drifting to sleep. Angelina was several hours late for the appointment she had made with Alphonse. They had arranged to meet at a coffee-house, but in the fluster of Marie-Catherine's pamphlet writing, she had forgotten all about her plans. Shaken by Nicola Tiquet's verdict, she decided to dispense with the convention of sending a messenger ahead of her visit as she bundled herself into a coat and shawl, She would expel her nervous mood by travelling on foot, paying a visit in person to Alphonse at his private residence. To her immense relief, Alphonse answered her knock on the door. "Angelina, what are you doing here?" He glanced around the street, apparently searching for her absent chaperone.
"I'm so sorry, Alphonse. I completely forgot about our meeting. I hope you weren't waiting too long."
"Not at all. I assumed the Baroness must have needed you for something. We can go now if you like. I'll just fetch my coat."
"If you don't mind," Angelina interrupted, "I'd rather we stayed here. I'm not sure I can face a crowd."
Alphonse hesitated. "Of course, if that's what you'd prefer." Come in," he said, waving her awkwardly into the single room of his apartment. His servant must have been out on an errand, for Alphonse helped her to remove her gloves and shawl. "I have a pie and a bottle of wine, so we shall be just fine," he assured her. Despite his uncertainty, he seemed as eager as she was for company, inviting her to sit on the small chaise longue arranged before the fireplace. A nosegay propped in a vase brightened the low table set between the chairs, and, apart from several balls of discarded paper near the grate, the cosy room was meticulously ordered. Alphonse's chamber was packed with books, its walls hung with paintings by little-known artists. The room caused her to sigh and exclaim with envy. To live entirely for oneself. To make one's own choice on when to set a meal, when to retire, how late to stay awake. The quarters she occupied at Marie-Catherine's were nothing to boast about. The former chambers of a maid her mother could no longer afford to pay. It was even smaller than her room at St. Anne's, though she resisted making comparisons and sounding complaints.
"How is your writing progressing?" she began,
unwilling to bring up the subject of Madame Tiquet's sentencing. It would be a pleasure to turn her mind to her pet topic instead. Marie-Catherine had corresponded with Mademoiselle L'Héritier about Alphonse's manuscript, and she had offered him a reading at her salon, like a real conteur. Alphonse searched her eyes. "It's worse than before. I've been studying the books you sent, but I've only become more stuck. I was up all night with my glass slipper tail, trying to learn it by heart. I practised in front of the mirror, but, Angie, I look like a court jester." Angelina smiled reassuringly. She would share her idea. In all honesty, she was secretly glad he had made little progress.
"If you can forgive me, I've been working on your story myself. If you really have nothing, which I do not believe for a moment, perhaps we can present my version. I've grown quite fond of it. We could perform it together. I had an idea I could bring along my lute. I used to play at St. Anne's and I've been practising again, so it would be no trouble."
Alphonse studied her, considering his response. He slapped his knee. "That's a splendid thought, Angie. Yes, let's do that."
"It would be a pleasure. Maman's not fond of editing either. It's fortunate you both have me. Not that she's been writing anything new of late."
She thought about mentioning Nicolas Tiquet's verdict, but still could not bring herself to broach the painful subject. Alphonse picked up a small knife from the table and removed an orange from the fruit bowl. He began to peel off the skin, the pith forming a spiral. "I'm relieved you've taken my story under your wing. In truth, I've abandoned the idea. I'm working on something else, but it won't be ready in time for the salon." Unsure how to respond, Angelina glanced at a portrait of a woman in a rounded frame.
"Who is this? You have such a likeness."
"My late mother," said Alphonse, his expression suddenly so forlorn she regretted the comment. Angelina selected an apple from the dish, biting into its flesh.
"But your fairy tale is fresh. It's different. That's a shame. Perhaps you can tell me about your new idea."
Alphonse sat back on the chaise, thoughtfully chewing the pieces of orange. There was a tension between them she did not recognise.
"Why have you fallen quiet?"
Angelina addressed his vest, frightened of catching something on his face. Perhaps she had been too bold, overstepping the boundaries of their new friendship. She had arrived at his home unannounced. She needed to slow down, to not be so overeager. Though she could not bear him closing up on her, just when they seemed to be forging a closer bond, especially about his writing.
"I'll leave you in peace," she said, reaching for her purse. "I'm sorry for disturbing you."
"There's no need to go," he said, meeting her gaze. But she could not read his expression.
"Alphonse,
She broke off, becoming aware of what was wrong. Of course, she had visited his home uninvited. He could have no doubt of her feelings for him. She might as well have propositioned him in a written declaration. And now he was trying to protect those feelings because of course he did not share them. She had suspected it before, but his awkwardness confirmed it. He was afraid to tell her the truth about himself. He preferred men. She had sometimes wondered if this might be the case. An explanation for his hesitancy, his occasional distance, but she had held out hope that she had been mistaken. Now she knew in her heart it was true. What was she to do with the kindred feeling they shared? She might as well have her suspicions confirmed. If he did not feel comfortable initiating discussion on the topic, she would show him that, although she had been brought up a religious, she had her own mind and formed her own opinions. Alphonse, being unlike other men, was what had drawn her interest, and she could not be free without acknowledging the immense space this difference occupied.
"You know, my papa prefers men too. The family curse that's been passed on to me. But I see no shame in it. There's a story about papa. He was arrested many years ago, imprisoned in the Bastille for several months."
Why was she running on so? She knew she should stop talking, but she was terrified of silence falling between them.
"He was staying as a guest of his good friend, the Marquis du Bosc, at the Luxembourg Palace. Papa had a fight with a lover. I don't know the details, but the fellow was spiteful. 2 handsome young men invited him to take a walk with them in the gardens for, you know."
Angelina looked at Alphonse, but could not read his features.
"For favours. It was his birthday. He thought it was a treat arranged by the Marquis, who was also fond of men."
Angelina frowned.
"Oh, don't be so shocked. I only tell you to try and explain myself. I don't hold your tastes against you. And so Papa went with the 2 young men into the garden, and they played a game, except it was all a ruse, a trick. The pretty young men were police officers, and they had Papa arrested for homosexual misbehaviour."
Alphonse frowned. "I thought you knew," he sighed.
"I did. I realised some time ago. That's why I'm telling you about my father," said Angelina.
She touched a finger to her brow and let out a slow breath.
"I understand as well as I'm able, being female, but we're alike in our fundamental natures. We shouldn't let it come between us. I'm just confused. I've no experience with attachments. You must be patient with me. I promised to nurse my wound in private."
"You've got it all muddled up," said Alphonse in a soft voice. He placed the knife back on the table and wiped his hands on a cloth. Standing up from the chair, he began to untie the knot of his cravat, feeling for its pins. Slowly he unwound the long sheath of fabric. She stared at him, unable to speak, as he shrugged off the brocaded doublet and placed it on the back of the chair. He unbuttoned the matching vest. Dressed in a cream shirt, he untied the cord at his neck and shook his arms, pulling the material over his head. Rather than reveal a bare chest, she saw that he wore a binding of white muslin, like bandages from the surgeon, around his upper chest. She was utterly and thoroughly surprised. Her mind scrambled to make sense of his revelation. Did her mother realize Alphonse was female? Was that why her mother had encouraged, in her coy fashion, their friendship? Angelina was quite certain that Marie-Catherine had long guessed at the truth about her infatuation with Henrietta, although the thought of her secret being so exposed shamed Angelina deeply. Was this her mother's way of easing her into Paris society? She was confused by her thoughts, by Alphonse standing there, vulnerable and silent on the couch. And then her stupid tongue took control. "For a moment I regretted visiting you without a chaperone," she said, wincing almost immediately at her own joke. Alphonse nodded, giving her a wry smile. "Perhaps you can now understand why the maiden warrior's tales been giving me the devil of a time." "I am such a fool," said Angelina, finding her voice. She brought her hands up to cover her face, which had turned a deep red. "I've been harping at you. I was beginning to suspect you had an inclination for your own kind, like me. But not like me, obviously. Oh, you must forgive me. I shall blame my idiocy on being sheltered too long by nuns who think a wimple and a prayer substitutes for the company of actual men." "Is that how you see me now, a false man?" said Alphonse, pulling his shirt back on. She had insulted him. "Not at all, She felt self-conscious about her gown. Lise had advised her on the flourish of a ribbon tied at her waist, which suddenly seemed false, a gesture to some fashionable, hence unfamiliar, notion of femininity. "How do you wish me to see you, if that's not impolite?" "Just as I am," smiled Alphonse, "just as I accept, and find much delight and amusement in, your gullible and excited self." "This is why Maman suggested you write your own Belle. She knows. Nothing escapes her." "She guessed. I thought you had too. I've lived like this for some time." "And it's not, forgive the question, it's not so you might be published? I mean—" "Not in the least." "All right, then," said Angelina, meeting his gaze and offering a courageous smile. "Perhaps you might give me some time to adjust. It's all those years being cloistered. I can grant that." He winked at her, coyly pursing his lips, and she was reminded of their introduction at Marie-Catherine's salon, his gift of putting her at ease. "You must write what urges you forward, but please make use of me for discussion. You've no idea how I miss the role. Do not mention this, but Maman is the one who's positively blocked. I'm supposed to be her secretary, but all I do is scribble speculations to her friends about Madame Tiquet. I'm thoroughly tired of it. It gave me immense relief to invent scenes for your fairy tale, as if I needed the task." "Might I set you straight about something that's bothering me?" "Anything," replied Angelina, drawing in a sharp breath. Perhaps he wanted to make a declaration, or disappoint her by confessing his affections lay elsewhere and were unreturned. Would she console him? Alphonse opened the bottle of wine, pouring them both a glass. "The information you just told me about your father, it's not quite true. I'm aware of his taste for men, as is all Paris. But he wasn't imprisoned for it. That would be most hypocritical of the king. The Duke of Orléans, his own brother, favours men, and the king loves him dearly. Your father was put in the Bastille for treason, for speaking seditiously against the regime.
I had no idea. Angelina picked up the wine goblet, taking a sip and settling it back on the table. She tried to recall where she had heard the story about her father. She was sure Deirdre had told it to her many years ago, but could not recall the occasion. It was as if she had always known it. But perhaps she had invented the narrative, told it to herself as a form of comfort to feel closer to him. In her current state, the Baron seemed the more likeable of her parents, even if he caused her mother grief. Their quarrel was not her affair, and she felt real affection for him, perhaps more than she felt for her mother. A strange thing, for they'd had little contact with one another. Still, she'd had no reason to question the veracity of Deirdre's explanation, and as far as her mother was concerned, it seemed the subject of her father's imprisonment was long buried, the tombstone chipped and the grave flourishing with weeds. "Perhaps one day you might ask Marie-Catherine her version of events," ventured Alphonse. "And risk her vexation," replied Angelina. "Now is not the time, I'm afraid. She's sleeping in her chamber at this very moment. I had to mix her a draught. We were at the courthouse this morning to learn Madame Tiquet's verdict. She's to be beheaded. I have been trying not to think about it. Maman is terribly distressed. I'm quite worried about her. She's not given away her mission to clear Madame Tiquet's name, but between you and me, I feel the case is quite hopeless. Which reminds me, she will be asking you to sign your name to a petition she's having printed. She's hoping to overturn the verdict at the appeal." "This is terrible news," said Alphonse. "I'm sorry to hear it. The poor woman. Of course, whatever Marie-Catherine needs from me, I'm indebted to her in more ways than one and happy to help." "She'll not forget your kindness." As the day progressed, Nicola's verdict, initially unbelievable, had begun to settle upon Angelina's thoughts as a reality. Marie-Catherine's information about the hardships Madame Tiquet had faced in her marriage made her feel decidedly queasy. Recalling the Sisters of St. Catherine from the Grand Châtelet, Angelina felt a chill curl along her spine. Perhaps she had turned her back on her true vocation. She had fewer qualms about the rituals of washing unidentified corpses, surely. She did not love them for a start. She might pray for their eternal souls, but the paths they had travelled to meet their ends were not entangled in the labyrinth of her secret cares.
This ends CD 7, CD 8.
Marie-Catherine, the 10th of June. Marie-Catherine glanced at the pair of watchmen, guarding the carriageway of Madame Fouche's opulent hotel, where she had an appointment with her publisher, Monsieur Cornelius Alberts. Inside, concerned that she had not dressed up enough for the occasion, she supplied the fastidiously groomed attending madame with his name. Scanning her writer's eye over the woman's powdered cheeks, rouged lips and towering headdress, she was relieved when a glamorous serving girl was called to lead her to his second-floor suite. The room was filled with pipe smoke. Cornelius dressed for an outing. He placed one hand inside a pocket of his jacket and held out the other. "What do you think, Baroness?" Cornelius fanned the coat for her to inspect the brocade, so heavy she could barely discern the colour of the fabric beneath. Marie-Catherine smiled. She did enjoy his eccentric ways. "You've outdone yourself." She adjusted her headscarf and straightened her posture. She hoped Monsieur Alberts had arrived in Paris in a mood of generous entrepreneurship. She must act her part. There could be no betraying her careworn thoughts as she showed him all the latest diversions occupying moneyed Paris. Not that she felt confident about her recommendations. Cornelius beckoned his assistant to gather his master's bag. An up-and-coming poet, by the looks of him, she thought, making a quick appraisal. He was pretty, vain, and simpering, and returned her an equally dismissive glance. They made a motley group, walking down the spiral staircase. She felt a little jealous of the sculpted cane Cornelius flourished, the orange and yellow paradise bird's feathers bobbing on his hat. A carriage was hailed, and the assistant relayed directions to the city's most expensive quarter for dining and shopping. Through the afternoon, Marie-Catherine stood painfully beside the lad as they scrutinized and admired the array of men's accessories Cornelius tried on. Doublets, tricorn hats, buckles, ribbons, lace, wigs. He ordered reams of fabric to be shipped to Amsterdam, sent to his personal tailor, hatter and cobbler. All the while he struck bargains with the proprietors, telling the shopkeepers that he was a wholesaler, an importer, a fashion maker. All lies, of course. He dined out frequently in Amsterdam, he told them, and attended the most important parties. Through his connections and associations, he would be able, at least potentially, to popularize the colour of a necktie or ribbon, the weave in a stocking, the buckles on a boot. With a wink and strike of his cane, Cornelius assured the sceptical shopkeepers that orders would flow from Amsterdam upon his return, transforming their discount into an advertisement, an investment, and all would benefit. Afterwards the porters secured Cornelius's boxes of treasure to the back of the coach, and he sought her advice on where to find the most lauded of the season's chefs, the most fawned-over menus. Out of her depth, Marie-Catherine recalled a restaurant she'd heard Teresa speak about, which served 3 types of fowl, goose, duck and quail, sewn together to resemble a basilisk. Cornelius frowned. He had tried the dish at home and thought it a gimmick. He brightened, seized with an idea. He would indulge her. Did she happen to know the address of the chef, Monsieur Fortescue? His establishment served a delightful fruit from the tropics, shipped weekly from the hothouses of The Hague. Pineapple, it was called. Had she tried it? Marie-Catherine studied Cornelius's eyes, lit with equal measure of cunning and child's excitement. White face powder caked the tip of his nose. They had been shown a table beside a window box. Cornelius wished to observe the street, though he despaired of its odours interfering with his dining experience. The chairs covered in brocaded cushions, the round table laden with gleaming silverware and oriental porcelain. She scrutinized the menu, but did not recognize the ingredients in many of the dishes, unconvinced about the marriage of several startling meat and vegetable combinations. But Cornelius was full of daring, declaring he wished to taste the most outrageous and unusual concoctions recommended by the chef. She must join him in the adventure. Aperitifs were served. Cornelius impressed the waiter, matching each course with a different wine. He was eager to sample the brine-barrelled fish. Once the apple of his eye, Marie-Catherine now detected an impatience in Cornelius, perhaps too strong a term. A sense that he no longer considered her every utterance a gem. A shift in regard had taken place, and she was struggling to reclaim her former position. She did not want him to grow bored in her company. The necessity of delighting and entertaining him made her feel like a courtesan. She must not stumble, must keep her wits about her. He was impossible to predict. Who knew what ideas preoccupied his secret thoughts? Her publisher was apt to be many steps ahead of her in their game. Contemplating a move she had no means of anticipating. The meal underway, she became aware of a narrowing of her attention, the prickling itch of the proposal she wanted to make. She ate a sliver of fish and swallowed a mouthful of wine. She would have to be patient, even if it made her squirm a little in the plush chair. Following dessert, the pineapple was sweet but fibrous, its flesh a little dry. She could wait no more for her publisher to ask why she had requested their meeting. By way of softening up, she would begin with the topic of fairy tales. Yes, Alberts replied. He was aware of the Parisian fashion for such stories. Although no similar trend had gripped the imaginations of Dutch readers, and he doubted it would do so any time soon.
"What of the English?" she ventured.
"Translations are so very expensive," Alberts replied. He asked for sales figures for her French titles. She offered an ever so slightly exaggerated figure. Alberts nodded, noting a rumour he had heard that the fairy tales of Charles Perrault were most edifying for young ladies. Marie-Catherine smoothed the impulse to curl her lip. "Yes, of course," Alberts went on. Her own brilliant concoctions warranted much praise. But were they not exceedingly long? And maybe she could imitate Perrault's style of closing each story with a morality poem, 6 lines of verse in which the theme of the story was distilled, along with a warning to the reader on how to avoid a similar plight. What did she think of that idea? There was perhaps a market opening for children's tales across the Channel. An enormous audience, potentially, brand new. Imagine grandmothers, nurses, mothers, fathers even, seated together before the fire, sharing a fairy story. Had she heard of Mother Goose? Cornelius unfolded his serviette. If she would consider shortening her tales, as they stood they were too long to arrest the attention of children, then perhaps they might discuss a proposal. How dare he? She thought, bristling. She would not touch her collection of fairy tales. They had been laboured over, edited, revised, perfected, and not a word could be added or taken away without destroying the integrity of the whole. Marie-Catherine dabbed her own serviette to her lips, hoping the gesture hid her annoyance. She pressed on. "I'm dissatisfied with my French publisher, if you must know. I wanted to gauge your interest in reprinting my fairy tales in French to be distributed in France and wherever else you think appropriate. I'm hopeful about the English. A translation would be wonderful, though I can't agree to any abridgments." "I shall run some sums," said Monsieur Alberts, his expression unchanged, "though I cannot promise a large payment. Your tales have made their debut already, have they not? You should have come to me 2 years ago. Do you have a manuscript, perhaps? Something new I can appraise? What of a second volume of fairy tales, of a shorter length, bearing in mind your readers' wandering attentions?" She did not reveal that she shared those very thoughts herself. But her imaginative powers, at least when it came to inventing magical miniature worlds, had all but evaporated. His openness to reading a new work was perhaps an opportunity to broach the topic of the idea she had been developing, to write a book about the life of a modern Frenchwoman. He could not disapprove of her return to writing novels, a style that in the past had earned her a respectable income. But she had not advanced beyond a rough outline of the setting. It was too risky. It must wait. "I shall consider your proposal," she said, reaching for her pocketbook. If she could not better her own circumstances, she could at least help Alphonse. It was time to deal her sweetener. She had mentioned in a letter to Alphonse the upcoming visit by her Dutch publisher, and he had answered by sending Angelina to her office with a revised copy of the manuscript he had sent her many weeks earlier. Although she had not been entirely honest with him about her reasons for showing his work to Alberts, she hoped to gain the publishing magnate's favour with the promise of a new writer, warming him up, making him receptive to her own, more difficult proposition. "What have we here?" asked Alberts, glancing at the package she drew out. "I do have something to show you, though not by my hand. It's by my young protégé, Monsieur Alphonse Apéride." "You know I have a swathe of these. The young writers of Paris are beating marks in my door." "Ah, but this is from me. I have an eye." "Do you wish me to look at it now?" "Why ever not?" challenged Marie-Catherine. Cornelius indicated to his assistant to open the package. Salubrious from the wine, he flipped over the first several pages. "Indeed," he said, raising his eyebrows. "You do have an eye."
He sought my advice. He's ambitious, so if you're at all interested, might you let me know soon?
Cornelius nodded, his eyes scanning the page. "I'll send a message before I return to Amsterdam."
Excellent.
Cornelius glanced at her, the old charm in his cheeks. "I may need to cancel my ticket to the opera this evening and stay in. You have a rival." "I'm only too aware," said Marie-Catherine, smiling. "He's a clever little bear indeed."
Is that all?
asked Alberts, as if sensing her secret agitation. Beneath the manuscript lay the thin pages of the pamphlet she had written on Nicola Tiquet.
I have one more favour to request of you, if you would hear me out.
Monsieur Alberts checked his watch, nodding. "If you must."
You know of Madame Nicola Tiquet, who has been condemned to death by our unfair laws?
"I do indeed. I have several writers in Paris following the case."
"But the words you publish in your broadsheets do not fall in her favour," said Marie-Catherine. "She is a dear friend of mine, and I've decided to help her. What would you say to using your presses to print a pamphlet, which will be distributed in Paris, that shall clear her good name?"
Alberts asked his assistant to prepare his pipe. "Isn't the case fairly clear-cut? In fact, didn't the trial establish a prior attempt upon her husband's life that only deepens her guilt? The citizens of Amsterdam also know of her reckless affair with the King's Guard."
"But that's not the full story," protested Marie-Catherine. "Her husband is beastly."
"If she were a political rebel, perhaps, or a writer such as yourself, I might be interested."
"Her father created the Carlier publishing house,"
said Marie-Catherine. "Which happens to be one of my biggest rivals," said Alberts. He drew on his pipe, the tobacco burning orange. "I should like to assist you, but my hands are tied. My own presses have been running a case built around Madame Tiquet's culpability. The thirst of my readers, both French and Dutch, is steep."
Marie-Catherine steadied her voice. She would not give up. "It need not involve your name. The document can be printed anonymously. I have several signatures already vouching support."
"And who is to pay for this? Do you have any idea of the expenses involved? Where will it be distributed? Do you intend to have it sold on the streets? What is your plan?"
"I had not thought that far in advance," confessed Marie-Catherine. She rubbed her brow. "I assumed you would be eager to see justice served. Perhaps I could raise funds. Might that help to change your mind?"
Alberts exhaled a plume of blue smoke. "You'll need to purchase yourself a pretty begging bowl."
Marie-Catherine picked up the pamphlet, thrusting it towards Monsieur Alberts. "Please, might you just read it?"
Monsieur Alberts offered to divert his carriage to Rue Saint-Benoît, depositing Marie-Catherine at her apartment. But in nearing Rue Saint-Dominique, she realized she had left her cape behind at the restaurant. Kindly, her publisher offered to send her back to the dining district in his carriage, but not before he had been delivered to his hotel suite. She had left him with a swathe of reading, and he had best get started on it, he joked, kissing her hand as he bid farewell. Back at the restaurant, the maître d'hôtel fetched Marie-Catherine's beloved black cape, which she fixed about her shoulders. Walking back to the carriage, she noticed a familiar figure exiting the great blue doors of the monk's infamous Maison de Plaisir across the street. The man glanced furtively along the avenue, looking for a carriage or palanquin, perhaps, to deliver him home. Meeting Marie-Catherine's surprised gaze, he hesitated for the briefest moment, as if deciding whether or not to acknowledge her. Father Etienne wore the black silks of a Dutch merchant, a tricorn hat white lace collar and high boots. Why, he could have been one of Cornelius's Amsterdam associates. Marie-Catherine calculated what to do. She had given him a letter to deliver to Nicola at the Grand Châtelet. If she spoke to him, it would be an opportunity to find out if he had met with her. "Etienne!" she called across the street, raising her hand in greeting. A moment later he was climbing behind her into the carriage. "I thought perhaps you were friendly with your housekeeper," she said a little stiffly, offering her gloved hand. "But I see you prefer to pay for your needs. Select the young flesh yourself." "And what of it?" said Father Etienne, affecting a nonchalant air. She would not let him off the hook so easily. He had been caught out. She held an advantage. Marie-Catherine glanced out of the carriage window, taking a moment to recover from the shock of encountering her old friend emerging from a brothel. "I received your letter," said Father Etienne. "How are you bearing up?" "As well as can be expected. I see why you claim your standing with the Church is not as strong as I'd hoped. This won't—" Marie-Catherine glanced into his eyes. "This won't affect things, will it? We still need your assistance." "Ah, it's no problem," said Father Etienne, waving his hand. He watched her. "I'm doing all I can to help, through the parish." "Thank you," said Marie-Catherine. She touched her temple, frowning. "I feel a dreadful headache approaching. I had luncheon with my Dutch publisher. He treated us to Monsieur Fortescue's, and I fear I drank too much wine." Father Etienne reached out his fingers to touch her elbow, and she flinched from the impropriety. "Have some sense," she hissed. His hands had been all over the body of a puta. Marie-Catherine felt desperate. "Things have been rather difficult of late. I've roused whomever I can think of in Paris to aid in Nicola's cause." Father Etienne laced his fingers together, waiting for her to continue. "I thought there was hope," said Marie-Catherine. "I truly did. But events have taken such a sudden, terrible turn, and so quickly. Her despicable husband will inherit her money, which was his design all along. At least her son shall be looked after. I am still not recovered from the news. Madame TK's fate has gripped our imaginations, though no good comes of tongue-wagging. I've not heard back from the Archbishop. He's our first contact. Through him we can try to catch the ear of the Pope. A long bow to draw." "Do you move within the Archbishop's circles?" asked Marie-Catherine. "No, I'm afraid," said Father Etienne. "Though I'm no outcast. He's a petty moralizer, a weak populist. I cannot make any promises, except that I shall continue to petition him. I shall build my case alongside yours. Remind him of Madame TK's habitually generous tithing." The carriage was nearing Saint-Sulpice, and she prepared to bid Father Etienne goodbye. She could not stop wondering about the woman he must have visited at the brothel. Oh, she did not want to trouble herself with the ways of men. She must keep his finer qualities at the forefront of her thoughts. The priest had agreed to help her. He was not the enemy. Indeed, he was perhaps her only friend. "Do you have a favourite?" asked Marie-Catherine, regretting her words as soon as they left her lips. Better to have kept her counsel on the matter. Father Etienne raised his eyebrows. "Never mind about me. I can't always wear a cassock." He brought his fingers to his lips and kissed them, gently placed them on her forehead as if blessing her. And, fool that she was, she found herself closing her eyes and submitting to the gesture, taking comfort from it. Journeying to her apartment in the borrowed carriage, she called the coachman to stop, asking one of the footmen to purchase her a copy of Histoire Journalière, Cornelius's broadsheet. Printed on the front page was a headline about Madame Tiquet's sentencing, but there was no new detail in the article, only the usual reminder at the conclusion that the city's residents were hanging on every word uttered about Madame's plight, eagerly awaiting the ruling of the High Court. Frustrated, she discarded the newspaper in the street. She would have to cancel this month's salon and ply the small well of funds she kept aside to run it into printing the pamphlet. Although Alberts had not given his word that he would assist her to publish the document, she had tried her very best to persuade him. There was every chance his mind would be changed by the strong words she had penned in Nicola's defence. Now she needed to nurture her strength and determination, for Alberts had set her up with a task to complete. She must call around the best houses of Paris with her collecting bowl. Perhaps there was still hope, a small candle flame to be cradled and protected, that she might save the life of her dear friend. Angelina, the 16th of June. In place of morning prayer, Angelina began to shower her maid with compliments, enticing her to divulge her tricks for dressing à la mode. Her toilette lengthened to include the application of a perfume cadged from Teresa — her sister had replaced it with a different scent — and the addition of undergarments that shaped her bust and waist. She had kept one handy adaptation from her days at the Abbey. The sisters did not travel with purses, instead using a device of detachable pockets which they fastened with a cord to their belts. The invention was practical and convenient, and she continued tying on the set she had accidentally taken with her on the day, it seemed so long ago, she had departed St. Anne's forever. She borrowed discarded copies of Le Mercure Galant, poring over illustrations that modelled ways to pin and comb her hair, experimenting with all of them. Before the household stretched awake, she rubbed rouge on her cheeks and scrubbed it off, beginning again and again, until she had perfected an artificial flush. With expert needlework, she altered the hems and cuffs of Teresa's discarded gowns, cutting away inches of silk and velvet to display the white ruffle of her petticoats and shirt sleeves. She visited Deirdre, playing dolls with her nieces, and then joined her elder sister in rounds of cards. The objective not to win coin, but to carefully observe Deirdre and her friends' mannerisms and gestures. If Alphonse could radically reinvent himself, then why not Angelina too? In the years of reading her mother's fairy tales, how she had missed the themes of metamorphosis, to the Baroness's preoccupation with masks and disguise. She had so deeply admired Marie-Catherine's inventiveness in describing magical objects and their delightful abilities. A turkey-leather treasure chest that spoke, an icy mirrored mountainside which reflected one's ideal image, a pennant woven with stars delicate enough to pass through the eye of an embroidery needle. Yet she had failed to pay attention to her mother's insights into human behaviour. Every one of the heroes and heroines that Angelina loved were forced to bear insults from their siblings and parents, even their servants, due to their beastly or otherwise compromised appearance. Their quests would not be complete until they had rediscovered their true forms. In The Great Green Worm, Princess Laidronette was cursed with ugliness by the fairy Magotine, secluding herself in a tower so as not to offend her parents. Even though the bewitchment was not her fault, her mother had forgotten to invite the fairy to Laidronette's christening. Prince Charming from the Bluebird was magicked into avian form for declining to marry the untrustworthy, scheming Truitonne, his feathers and beak preventing him from declaring his love for Princess Florine. Belle, who donned a chevalier's armour to help restore his father's dwindling fortunes, had his breasts exposed like an Amazon, and was almost stabbed to death for refusing the affections of a selfish and conniving queen. Although she had been unprepared for Alphonse's revelation, in many ways it felt as though nothing had really changed. She felt entirely comfortable with the masculine terms he used to define himself, and was surprised to discover how simply and fully her entire being accepted him. She suspected it was because he had so much to teach her. His lessons were invisible little beans of wisdom, hidden in his fancy vest pockets. He was always drawing one out and giving it to her, as if the supply were infinite. The only thing that had changed was the disappearance of any uneasiness between them. She either met with Alphonse or wrote to him every day, and he always answered before sundown. Between their correspondences, she laboured at her diary, her observations and reflections running in clear, looping sentences that filled many pages. Marie-Catherine had taken to leaving the apartment early, each morning, to attend meetings in the hotels and homes of Paris's most influential residents. She insisted on travelling alone to carry out her task, sipping tea with patriarchs and occasionally nobles in the hope of securing funding to print her pamphlet. Since Madame Tiquet's sentencing, her mother's moods had become increasingly volatile, by turns fragile and coolly determined, and Angelina did not wish to upset the delicate equilibrium of the household by arguing. Consequently, for the first time since she had left St. Anne's, Angelina found herself with uninterrupted periods in which to muse upon her new life. Freed of the convent's regimented daily observances, at first a void that left her fearfully summoning God, though it was mostly a habit, she had started listening to her interior observations. She'd not realised, but for some time after leaving the convent, she had swung between emotional extremes. Some days she felt homesick, her mouth almost watering for a bite of the biscuits, sweetened with dried peel that the novices baked for Easter. But then she would clench her teeth in resentment, recalling how thoroughly she had been instructed in the habit of sifting through her conscience, combing her thoughts for impurities. She nearly shook in frustration, reminding herself that the delight she felt in preparing to go out visiting, in stopping to admire the baroque notes of a nightingale, or enjoying the way a cat rubbed its paws over the milk-flecked whiskers, could be experienced without reflecting upon the omnipotence of God. Freedom to move in Paris in combination with her skills at self-examination led her to hope that her new-found sensory pleasures, along with the forest of carnal desire she harboured for Alphonse, were good. That the spreading force, its new branches, the waxy green shoots and flowering buds that reached into every corner of her perception, was not sinful, not wrong. Leading by example, Alphonse had cured her of the fault of dismissing the predilection and conventions of her fellow Parisians, who only a month ago had seemed so threatening and mysterious. She was no longer bound as tightly by strictures of dress and behaviour. She had even allowed herself to admit that for the first time since she could remember, she had no clear picture of her future. It did not matter, for she had this very hour, this moment, upon which to spend her attention. Where once she itemised subjects to discuss with Alphonse, their correspondence began to flow without pause, each thought or anecdote revealing novel twists and turns in its course of exploration. One morning she decided to bring up the topic of her confused feelings towards her father. Perhaps Alphonse could advise her. "I have begun to wonder of late why I have not visited Papa to deliver his medicines and check upon his well-being myself. I seem to make excuses, or, if not that, be subjected to endless interruptions. Have I perhaps fluttered to the opposite extreme, in my haste to throw off the chains of a life of head-bowed service to others, and embraced a persona of feckless self-absorption?
Though I do not truly believe this of myself, I do not always understand the motivations behind my own choices. Perhaps I am merely casting about for ways to justify my newfound, and rather enjoyable, self-regard. Should I pay him a call, or would it upset Maman? I cannot make up my mind which direction I should take.
Alphonse had answered her quandary in a letter delivered that afternoon, with an interesting response. I fear you worry yourself too greatly about whether to act upon your sentiments. If you really are concerned about your papa's well-being, which certainly seems the case, then why not get yourself organized and simply pay the fellow a visit? It should not be all that difficult to arrange. You must recall my interest in the Baron's life. He is a fascinating gentleman, and you would do well to uncover more of his story from his own mouth. Given their history, I am unsure if Marie-Catherine's version of events can be depended upon. Forgive me if I overstep a line of propriety, but you asked for my opinion. As you observe, the Baron is not a well man, and he will not always be there for you to speak with. He really is an eminently interesting, if notorious, personality. Might I add that if you do decide to call upon him, you could consider inviting me along. I should very much enjoy listening to some of the old raconteurs' war stories.
Alphonse's thoughts had been enough to dissolve any last qualms, and she sent a messenger to the Baron's address.
At the corner of Rue Saint-Lambert, Angelina hooked her elbow into Alphonse's arm, pulling him near, returning with defiance the haughty, lingering stare of a decorated madame, who was strolling with her small leashed dog and her lady's maid. Perhaps in time her convent learning might fade of its own accord, but she felt such an impatience to reinvent her internal self, an intention as pure as any toward God, though growing in the opposite direction. With renewed vigour, she wiped away the lessons of seclusion and silence the convent had tried to write into her flesh.
"You're not to tax him," she whispered.
"My impeccable manners shall be on display," replied Alphonse, making a mocking bow as he waited for her to pass through the Baron's arched doorway.
She had to stifle a guilty plummeting in her stomach, regretting again her carelessness towards her father's health. The valet showed them to a small courtyard on the ground floor of Francois' apartment, where he was resting on an outdoor chaise. A blanket covered his withered legs, and a wide-brimmed hat protected his face from the sun's rays. He had grown thinner since her last visit, his face taken on a greyish pall. She was not sure which parent was to blame, but one of them had lied about the efficacy of the quince, primrose and garlic elixir she had sent over for him to drink. "Papa?"
she whispered. The Baron started, raising his head and blinking at her, as if he had been dozing. "If she had only arrived a moment earlier," he lamented, grasping her around the wrist to hold himself straight. "She could have joined him to watch a spectacular theatre." He pointed a wizened finger at a stone bird bath. A thrush had been pecking at the breadcrumbs his servant sprinkled around the edge, when out of nowhere swooped a yellow-eyed sparrowhawk to snatch up the smaller bird in its talons. "What powerful shoulders, Angie! It didn't miss a beat. The perfect snare."
"The poor thrush," said Angelina, unable to stop her eyes searching the bird bath for droplets of blood and stray feathers.
"It's nature's way," said Alphonse, meeting Francois' eye to solicit his agreement. She had almost forgotten to introduce him.
"Meet my companion, Monsieur Apéride," she began, explaining that he was a writer, though omitting his friendship with Marie-Catherine. There was no need to bring her father's nemesis into their conversation. "He needs to find himself a patron."
"It's an honour to meet you, Baron d'Aulnoy," said Alphonse, extending his arm. The Baron clasped his hand, squinting a moment, and then nodding in approval. "You're rather handsome for a writer. Is this because you're a fellow?" he joked. Turning towards Angelina, he remarked that he approved of Alphonse's influence. He could see that she was making an effort with her appearance, and was glad she had put the convent behind her. "Is there a little more between you two?" he asked, eyebrows raised. Angelina glanced at Alphonse, but he had not registered the comment. She felt her cheeks turn pink.
"Oh no, it's not like that at all. We're just friends."
Francois nodded, a smile lifting the corners of his mouth as if he were unconvinced. "Whatever you say, daughter, it's my pleasure. And my blessed relief your mother isn't the only person you take directions from these days. There is yet hope." He inquired as to how she was finding Paris. It was high time she enjoyed herself, he said, adding that years ago he'd had a fierce argument with Marie-Catherine about taking her out of St. Anne's. But she wouldn't hear of it. It's rather gratifying to have my intuition confirmed.
"You might have asked me," said Angelina.
She wondered how old she was when her parents had this conversation, but something stopped her from asking. Perhaps it was better not to know, though she was inclined to agree with her father. Surely it would have been better to return to Paris on the brink of becoming a woman, suffering the changes to her body, the questions that occupied her thoughts when she tried to pray, with the counsel of her mother and sisters. Instead, she had crotchety and doddery nuns, whom she cared for very much, of course, but all the same, her blood relatives, even if they disagreed, might have made the ordeal less solitary and frightening. The valet had brought chairs out, and Francois invited them to sit near him. They had to gather in close, as failing hearing was one of a multitude of ailments afflicting him. He asked Alphonse where his family were from, pleased to learn they were Parisians. "My father fought against the rebels in the Fronde, like you," said Alphonse. This was news to Angelina. She glanced at Alphonse, hoping he might offer more details about his past. She wanted to ask him about his family, but had not dared, concerned she might remind him of an unpleasant confrontation. Francois inquired as to his regiment and rank. The senior apéride had not been as powerfully placed as the Baron, though he had been involved in the fighting in Bordeaux in 1653. "How unfortunate I never met him," said Francois. He glanced into the canopies of the plane trees fringing his neighbour's garden. "I lost count of the number of times I cheated death. Once I just missed having my arm sliced off. My companion was badly wounded, and something got into my head, and I went quite mad, attacking the bugger who stabbed him. I managed a good jab, but it was too late. My friend was too injured to survive." He turned to Angelina, a faint smile lighting his thinned cheeks. "I was powerfully built in those days, daughter, and I had a couple of excellent horses. What I wouldn't do to go riding," he sighed. "It's been so long I can barely remember what it's like." Alphonse nodded. "Father caught a musket ball in his thigh, and that was the end of fighting for him. He still walks with a limp." Angelina followed their conversation with fascination. She had never heard her father speak of his experiences as a soldier, though she worried that Alphonse was tiring him out. He was sitting up in his chair, his face reddened with emotion, his hands waving about as he described returning to the battlefield to retrieve his friend's body for burial. She did not wish to be responsible for his collapse. Glancing at Alphonse, she frowned, nodding her head slightly, silently asking him to take pause. But, for the second time that morning, Alphonse behaved as if her opinions and presence were not important. He asked Francois if he had been decorated for his services to the crown. His own father's medals counted amongst his most precious items. He had them encased in glass in a custom-built cabinet.
"Summon that dolt of a valet," Francois said. "They're packed away, but I think I remember where they are."
The servant was asked to fetch the brandy bottle and several glasses, and then to rummage in a chest in the attic. He was not to reappear until he had located the case of awards.
"Are you not tiring yourself?" interrupted Angelina. "Surely your physician has not prescribed drinking as a medicine?"
Francois turned to Angelina, a fierce expression in his eyes.
"That torturer visited me yesterday."
He pointed to his leg.
"He took to my calves with his lancet, slicing away flesh as if that might effect a cure. Look under there, and see his new additions to my sufferings."
Angelina checked his face to confirm he really meant her to lift the blanket. Both of his legs were wrapped in muslin bandages, watery dried blood staining the fabric.
"Ulcers,"
he said, a quiet rage entering his voice.
"He says they're caused by my lungs. I've never heard such rot. The damn fool."
Angelina accepted the glass of brandy the valet poured. She felt out of her depth. Who did she think she was, fancying she could help ease her father's suffering in his final days? Her mother had lied to her about his decline, saying Angelina's useless concoctions were working, flattering her for her own ends. Marie-Catherine would be only too happy, thought Angelina uncharitably, to hasten Francois's demise. She lowered the blanket and excused herself. Entering her father's apartment earlier, she had noticed a cabinet of medicines in the kitchen and decided to go back inside the house to examine them. But it was no use. The Latin titles on the labels did not note the active ingredients. She had brought in her purse a new bottle of the apothecary's elixir, though she suspected it would be ineffective. She recalled the solution Le Chinese she had also purchased, opium poppy. If only she had known how unwell he was, she might have included it. At least she remembered a good remedy for lung infections that did not require any draughts or ointments. Returning to the sunny courtyard, she addressed Francois.
"Might I listen to your chest? If you allow me to rub your back, it may help to dispel some of the fluids."
Francois acquiesced. She asked Alphonse to help her turn him over on the lounge. She promised not to cause him pain. He was to breathe in and out as instructed. Listening to his back, she heard a crackling sound when he drew in air. She moved her hands along his spine, whispering gently to him, working her fingers towards his neck, and soon he was coughing, expressing phlegm. Francois sat up and held his glass up to the sun, turning it so that the light glinted off the facets in the crystal. He claimed it was the only medicine that truly worked, although the massage Angelina had given his back seemed to have cleared his breathing. The valet returned, carrying a small trunk covered in green leather with brass studs. Francois had the fellow open it, proudly exclaiming over the medals inside, which he allowed Alphonse to handle, explaining what each stood for in the realm.
"Is there a reason you keep them hidden away?" asked Angelina.
She decided to forgive Alphonse for prizing her father's stories from him, overexciting him in a way that only emphasized his frailty. It was good that Alphonse had made her father divulge his memories of the Fronde. Had she visited with Teresa, the conversation would never have taken place. Suddenly, she felt gripped by the fear that she might never have another opportunity to talk with him like this.
"Only that I became disillusioned with the regime? A not uncommon sentiment," said Francois.
"Alphonse tried to tell me that you were imprisoned in the Bastille for lèse-majesté," said Angelina, "though I do not believe it for a moment. You're a patriot at heart."
"Dear girl," said Francois,
frowning at Alphonse. "That was a lifetime ago. A terrible misunderstanding between the sovereign and I. Thankfully I had high-placed friends who spoke out in my defence."
"But why would you voice such opinions? And who betrayed you?"
Francois studied her wearily, as if considering how to answer her question. He raised his glance at Alphonse, signalling he would like it refilled. "All you need to know is that I wasn't to blame. There was no conspiracy, at least not on my part, and I had every right to voice my dissatisfaction with the Crown, as do all subjects. But we must be careful about whose ears we whisper our discontent into. It's not as if I were born titled, like many. I've worked and bargained and negotiated for every leave." Francois took the glass from Alphonse. "You wish to know who my sworn enemies were? Why my speeches were recounted to Monsieur Colbert?" He looked at Angelina, his eyes narrowed, a great anger risen in his chest. "Your grandmother and your own mother, the same age as you are now. They hired a pair of ruffians, who plied me with drink and rich food, to sit at a gambling table, while they fished for my opinion of the king, and then reported it back to Judith Angelique, who wrote it up in a report."
Angelina frowned. "That is the first I have heard of such events. Are you quite sure?"
she asked, looking at Alphonse. He did not meet her eyes. His attention was fixed squarely on her father. "It is a fact," said Francois.
Angelina closed her eyes, feeling faint. She remembered her 12th birthday. Her father had sent her a gown, yellow satin with black brocade, a motif of bees sewn into the bodice. Whistling in admiration, Sister Agatha had helped her try it on. A faraway look on her face. There was an invitation to a party in which she was to be presented to some of his friends. The following day her mother had visited, bringing cake and a flask of cordial. Angelina had been permitted to receive her in the abbess's drawing-room, rather than behind the visitors' grill. She told her mother about the party, asked her what she planned to wear, and was shocked when she replied that it had been called off. It was not appropriate for a novice to appear in society, she said. Her father, as was his way, had no understanding of the convent's protocols. She had apologized and assured her she would speak to him. Angelina had entirely forgotten the incident. She wondered if it had anything to do with her father's confession that he had tried to have her released from St. Anne's. Perhaps she did not know her mother's heart at all. It was after the desolate little gathering between them that Marie-Catherine had started sending her fairy tales to read and respond to, asking what the novices thought of her stories. It had been a ploy, she realized, to make her forget her father's plans. And it had worked. Never had her parents asked her if she wanted to stay at St. Anne's, and never had the idea that she might be released into either of their homes occurred to her. She could not fathom why, but she had simply accepted her lot, behaving as if the future were already decided, destined to unfold in long, dreary hours of observance and faith, unchanged and hideous and cold with loneliness. Angelina motioned for Alphonse to refill her glass. "Perhaps what you say is true," she began, "though I'm shocked by it. They must have had their reasons." "I'll give you one guess," said Francois. "Coin?" said Angelina, with false lightness. "Knowing the two of you, I'll wager it was over money." Francois spluttered in his drink. "I did not expect you to be so astute, but you are correct, child. Your grandmother, who loved to play cards and go to shows, was not left the fortune she had anticipated following her husband's death. Neither of them liked me spending Marie's inheritance, though by law it was mine to disperse however I saw fit." Angelina's hand
rushed to cover her mouth, hiding her alarm, for she had been half joking. She was only too aware of how differently Marie-Catherine viewed the topic of the Baron pilfering her inheritance. But she could not begin a disagreement with him while he languished in such a poor state. Controlling herself, she patted the Baron's arm, took the glass from his hand and put it on the small table out of his reach. She called the valet and told him that the Baron had received his share of the day's sun and that to leave him outside any longer would risk cooking him like a lobster. She made Alphonse help the valet take him upstairs. Alone in the courtyard, she slumped into her chair. She wished it not to be true, wanted it to just be the Baron's bitter exaggerations, but it made a certain undeniable sense. No wonder her mother had defended Nicola so vehemently. Angelina had been confused by Marie-Catherine's obsession with the case. What was Nicola to her, after all? A friend, certainly, but the pair were hardly kindred spirits. Angelina had assumed it to be simply a maternal sentimentality on Marie-Catherine's part. But no, they were linked in far deeper ways. Both had flouted the law, perhaps flouted all decency, in order to be rid of their husbands. No wonder her mother had been too afraid to visit Nicola in the Grand Châtelet. Even this could be forgiven, though. What truly bothered her was a far more personal question. Why had her mother not extended such determined care to her own daughter? Angelina pushed the thought away. She had heard enough and spoken enough and thought enough about her childhood. The long, thick rope of her memories, identical days which passed in and out without remark or alteration, had revealed unseen knots and kinks, whole sections that were badly frayed and threatened to come loose. She was no page-bound heroine, but if she were, then this would be the moment for her fairy helper to make her presence known, and present her with a ring that told the future, a cloak that made her invisible, a flying carpet, something, anything, to tell her what move to make next. While the valet and Alphonse tended Francois in his room, she boiled a pot on the stove and steeped the herbs she had brought from her garden to make a poultice. For now it was the best assistance she could offer. She would send Alphonse on his way. They had been planning to practice the story from Mademoiselle L'Héritier's salon. But if she had to rehearse her role one more time, she would surely scream. Besides, after all the help she'd been giving Alphonse, which he didn't seem to appreciate, he had responded by driving a wedge into the heart of her family. She needed to be alone with her diary. She needed to think about her mother, who appeared to have nurtured her on the sour milk of lies. Nicola, the 17th of June. Nicola's nostrils ached in the cold air. A faint throbbing around her wrists, where she had been shackled to the iron ring in the courtroom weeks ago. Sore ribs, a pain in her hip from the guard's rough handling. She turned the page in her Bible, the tiny printed words appearing double. The meal she had been fed for luncheon made her ill, and she had vomited on the floor. She had let herself slump where she crouched over the chamber pot for a while, lacking the will to remove herself to the hard bed. Her nails were torn from picking, her breath sour, her shirt loose and foul-smelling. She heard the rustle of keys in the lock of her cell door. Every drop of blood in her veins pulsed, the nerves in her fingers and calves prickling awake. A guard hoisted her to her feet. She had been kneeling at her table praying, but had fallen forward, her forehead resting on the wood. Water cooled her cheeks, the faint scent of soap in the cloth, as it moved over her nose and lips. The lieutenant criminal, Monsieur de Fite, who was chief of the investigation, stood exceedingly close to her, a hand on her elbow, waiting patiently for her to meet his gaze. When she raised her head and lifted her eyes, he searched her face, trying to determine the clarity of her expression. De Fite seemed to find what he was looking for. He spoke her full name and asked her to confirm her surroundings and circumstances. His nose was broad, and the light green eyes above it seemed familiar. "The Supreme Court trial has concluded," he said, reading from a handwritten document. "The findings of the magistrates of the Parliamentary Court are in favour of the municipal ruling. You are to be beheaded, as befits your rank, on the day after tomorrow at 5 o'clock in the evening. A stay of execution for the duration of 24 hours has been granted to allow for observance of the feast of Corpus Christi in the town square, after which a scaffold and gibbet will be erected for your punishment in the Place de Grève. Do you understand what I am saying, Madame Tiquet?" he asked, his voice trembling. She raised her eyes to meet his intense green gaze and nodded. She had met him before. Years ago at a party organised at Versailles, a masquerade ball with masks imported from Venice. Perhaps her mind was playing tricks. She was unfed. She had been harangued. But how could she forget those piercing green eyes? If it were the same fellow, maybe she had something she could press to her advantage, though she hardly cared any more. The lieutenant criminal was flamboyant in his other life. She vaguely recalled his startling outfit, a harlequin of some sort, the silver locks of his wig, the delighted twinkle in his eye when they had been introduced. They had danced together, and he'd been flirtatious. He liked her, she recalled. What else had transpired that night? She remembered. She'd been hoping to see Montgeorges. Gilbert Montgeorges, as was his way, had been dutifully supervising the king. Unlike Matthias, her brother had asked someone to stand in so he could enjoy a dance with his wife, Matilda. Montgeorges had refused to offer her his hand, even though she had travelled specially to see him. She had sent a maid to him with her empty dance card, hoping he might fill the first position, but he turned her down, his duty to the king trumping any frivolities. Yes, it had been the lieutenant criminal. She remembered Matthias's and then Matilda's eyes meeting hers, the pair almost brushing shoulders with her as they spun. The king was seated, his courtiers fanning about. Nicola had scanned the crowd and found Montgeorges looking wistfully at her. She could never tell what he was thinking. She had been a little drunk, and when de Fite requested the next dance, she had declined, protesting that the wine had made her light-headed. "I understand, monsieur," she replied now, not caring about the tears that spilled down her cheeks. The lieutenant glanced at the pocket of his doublet. He folded the wretched document and drew out a handkerchief, which he passed to her. "Thank you." "May the prayers and thoughts of all Paris and the court of Versailles enter you, as you prepared to be delivered from this mortal coil." De Fite waited for her to recover her composure. She asked if she might sit on the bed. She did not have the strength to stand. He stood before her looking ridiculous, his reluctance interfering with his formal duties. He wiped his brow and opened the thick vellum paper again, pausing before he read further details of her sentence in accordance with the state's procedures. The blanket was the same grey as her skirt, though a slightly darker shade, the material coarser. She tried to concentrate. 100,000 livres were to be paid to Monsieur Tiquet's estate. Jacques Mouet had been sentenced to death by hanging. Her head was to be struck from her neck, but not before she was put to the question, ordinary and extraordinary, tortured, to ascertain the names and dates of the accomplices to her crime. She had been condemned, but it was not real. She could not digest the decree as fact. "You enjoyed pleasures," said de Fite sadly. "What a difference between your past comforts and your state on this day. You must summon all fortitude, madame, to receive with humility this bitter cup. Salvation lies within it. You should throw yourself into the arms of God and beg his mercy, invoke his name that he might help you bear the weight of your cross. Though your punishment is dreadful, it need not frighten you. Consider that sincere repentance will make it short. Please, madame, for the sake of your soul, confess to your crime." She gathered her strength. "I kneel before you as a supplicant. You have known me, sir. You used to admire me in those days of pleasure, do you remember?" He broke from her gaze then, and she felt some small moment of satisfaction. "As to the rest, I am not aggrieved by my punishment. The day that terminates my life will also put an end to my misfortunes. I do not pretend to brave death, but I know that I can support it. I shall answer from the platform with composure. I shall attend my fate with steadiness and not be disordered on the scaffold or at the last gasp of my unhappy life." "You must confess, Madame Tiquet," said de Fite, his voice low and urgent. "Do you not understand? You are to be tortured, and then put to death. I exhort you to admit your crimes." "But I am innocent." "Then you leave the crown no choice," said de Fite. "May God be with you." She used the last of her strength to reply. "If you are finished, then leave me be. Permit me to return to my prayers." A clank of chains. The door locked shut. Calls from the other prisoners as de Fite and his guards made their solemn way down the long corridors. Punched in her body, punched in her lungs, the world ceased to move. Like in a game of chess, the last gesture in a long series of manoeuvres had been made, and she was defeated. Outplayed by Claude, by the city and its foul systems of justice. Father Etienne had visited more than a week earlier, secretly delivering what she realized might be her last message from the outside world, a letter from Marie-Catherine. Her friend was writing petitions, gathering signatures, a small comfort, but she sensed a desperation in her words. The letter was more heartfelt wishes, condolences even, than a firm plan to have her freedom restored. She could only hope Marie-Catherine's efforts might be rewarded at the last hour. There had been no news regarding Jean-Paul, though what could she expect? Marie-Catherine was no friend to Claude, and it would be risky for her to contact him when she was battling his case so furiously. Nicolas sighed, blinking away a bitter tear. Her attempt to improve her circumstances had come to naught. Jean-Paul sent to his father, Claude to inherit her fortune. She had lost everything, struck by blow after blow. She could not tell if the harshest beatings had already been carried out, or if they lay in wait. She steadied her shaking limbs and crept down from the bed. She stood before the barred window, watching the murky grey pane of the insensate river. Again she crouched before the candle and rosary, bringing the beads to her lips. The cold floor stung her knees, but she ignored it, drawing her reddened fingers over the cover of the holy book, opening it to where she had folded back the page. The walls of her cell, smeared with the agony of mortals stepped into chains long before herself, seemed as flimsy as the paper upon which her sentence had been written. Was she becoming mad in her abandonment? She imagined Gilbert, pacing the grounds of Versailles, tearing at his hair. Should so much as a snigger reach him from his ranks, his peers, he would whip around, sword drawn. For an exquisite moment she saw the faces of Jean-Paul and Clotilde, their limbs as pale as marble sculptures. No, her mind was not functioning. Children, rats, spiders, all were ghosts. The soft black beat of wings she could not see in the dark, the feathery breath of angels whispering in her ears.
This ends CD 8, CD 9.
Part 4. Marie-Catherine, the 17th of June. Marie-Catherine had left the meeting with Abbess Durée, burdened with a heavy weariness. The formidable head of St. Mary's, one of Paris's oldest orphanages, to which Nicolas Tiquet annually donated a considerable sum, had refused to stamp the institution's support on her petition. The abbess expressed her sincere regrets, privately agreeing with Marie-Catherine's complaints about judicial bias against wives, but explained that she could not risk upsetting her donors. If she was seen to publicly question the court ruling, she might lose funding from some powerful sources. It was a situation she could not countenance. The orphanage's survival was precarious enough. Marie-Catherine made a valiant effort to turn around her defeated spirits. Sophie was helping her to change into her evening gown, fussing over her hair and complimenting her, paying her small but significant part in showing support. But pressing concerns continued to dance and weave in her mind. Had she gone to the meeting at the orphanage secretly knowing that it would not be successful? Was she taking a kind of dark pleasure in all this, rubbing salt into the wound of Nicola's imprisonment? If she'd had her wits about her, she might have sent a messenger to the orphanage and cancelled the scheduled appointment, not wasted the abbess's precious time. For inside her heart she was only too aware that this last attempt at help was futile. Although she had gathered significant funds during the past week, and a few signatures for her petition, it was not nearly enough to cover the printing of the pamphlet, nor, she feared, to sway the magistrate's final decision. She had heard nothing back from Cornelius Alberts, despite writing him 2 pleading notes asking for an answer to her proposal. Perhaps his response lay in the silence of his indifference. Perhaps it was time that she admitted her powerlessness, her defeat. Alphonse and Angelina were debuting Alphonse's fairy tale at Mademoiselle L'Héritier's salon, and she needed to be in attendance to show her support. If it were any other evening engagement, she would have cancelled her plans, turning early to bed to nurse her disappointment. Stepping into the carriage behind Angelina, she gave herself a firm talking to. She must stop thinking of herself and Nicola. She had barely slept all week and was in sore need of respite. Surely the salon and its guests would shake away her preoccupations, lift her glum mood. After all, she'd had to cancel her own salon. With Nicola's funds channelled into the police guarding her apartments, she simply could not afford to hold it. Had she not earned an evening of pleasantries? Marie-Catherine watched Mademoiselle L'Héritier seated near the stage. The salon's hostess inclined her head towards her uncle, Monsieur Charles Perrault, and was whispering into his ear. The famous fairy-tale writer nodded in reply, his pouchy eyes fixed on the object of their contemplation. Embellishing her comment, Marie-Jeanne waved her thin arms, only pausing when Charles turned pointedly towards her. His silver brows drew down over sharp brown eyes as he delivered a small but unmistakable reprimand. Marie-Catherine let her gaze travel towards Alphonse and Angelina, who were about to resume their performance. Perhaps the salon's hostess was making a note of how suitable Alphonse appeared to the task of recital. His elbow rested across a high-backed chair, an index finger touched his temple, a stockinged knee was lost behind the folds of Angelina's gown. Or Mademoiselle L'Héritier might have been complimenting Angelina. Seated in the chair, her shoes propped on a velvet footstool with tiny gold tassels fringing the legs, plucking her lute with the confidence of a court entertainer. Eventually Angelina opened her eyes, passing the lute to a waiting servant. The musical interlude concluded, she affixed a veil over her hair. Alphonse sprang to action, plopping a baggy feathered cap over his wig. Speaking in false voices and using exaggerated gestures, the duo performed the final act of the fairy tale Alphonse had written, introduced by Mademoiselle L'Héritier as the clever deception. Although she had been the one to suggest Alphonse add another fairy tale to his manuscript, Marie-Catherine wondered if her advice had been misconstrued. While she had reread Alphonse's revised stories, in her eagerness to submit a fresh voice to Cornelius and earn his favour, she had ignored a niggling intuition of disappointment. In her marginal criticisms, she had been clear, indicating when he had failed to develop a plot, or swerved too closely to another conteuse's interpretation of a tale. While Alphonse had indeed addressed all her concerns, his revisions to the manuscript lacked depth, as if he had grown impatient with finessing its finer points. Perhaps she had made an error, delivering it to Cornelius before it was quite ready. And another matter pricked at her thoughts. The fairy tale, as performed, seemed to possess a layer of meaning that she had not picked up on the page. The story unfolded with a noblewoman feuding with her father upon discovering he planned to marry her to a duke to whom she felt little more than indifference. Convinced that her future lay in composing verses, the noblewoman fashioned the disguise of a poet and ran away from home. It was a strong premise. Arriving at the court of a provincial king, the poet discovered there was a competition being held to invent the best verses in praise of the kingdom. The prize was the hand of the king's daughter in marriage. There followed some confusing business, with the princess having already chosen her preferred suitor, a duke who was dunce-headed but handsome. The real story, Marie-Catherine gathered, took place between the princess's lady-in-waiting and the poet. The princess learned of the poet's reputation for composing verse and hired him, passing his words as issuing from the quill of the duke, using the lady-in-waiting as intermediary. Marie-Catherine heartily approved of the princess's resourceful interference in her father's plans to choose her husband. Captivated by how effortlessly and brilliantly the poet composed his stanzas, the lady-in-waiting declared an inclination towards him, which was all well and proper, according to fairy tale convention. But, rather than delight the audience with supernatural tricks, Alphonse's story lingered on the conversations between the poet and the lady-in-waiting, who passed their time together inventing character portraits of the royal family and discussing the finer points of courtly etiquette. The tale concluded with the princess marrying her favourite, the bard's true identity unrevealed to the king and his court. Rather, the king awarded the honour of court verse-maker to the poet, who not only maintained his deception, but commenced a romance with the lady-in-waiting, who had discovered that he wore a mask at the beginning of the second act. Marie-Catherine did not understand why Alphonse flouted the fairy tale form. Perhaps it did not matter, for the salon audience had leapt to their feet, waving their handkerchiefs at her daughter and protégée, who stood holding hands and smiling proudly, bowing until the crowd's enthusiasm ran its course. Perhaps the fault lay with herself, and she had failed to detect a hidden nuance. Had she become too constricted by the formulae she had developed to shape her own tales? The rules she set out, the twist she always delivered in the last few lines. Angelina had revealed a fully developed talent for acting before a crowd. Marie-Catherine had attended several of her daughter's musical recitals at St. Anne's, but the performance she had just delivered to Mademoiselle L'Héritier's salon, her voice, her costume changes, her facial expressions, and perhaps most of all, her self-assurance, was an unexpected treat. She observed her youngest daughter, penned near the stage area, conversing with a simperingly attractive young woman. The mademoiselle was petite, her hair curled beneath a high fontange, and she moved her hands about in exaggerated affectation. Angelina, in comparison, seemed almost regally reserved, lowering her eyes and gently shaking her head, resisting and then suddenly yielding as the woman took her hand and pulled her away from Alphonse. She was dragged through a warren of closely arranged chairs towards the far corner of the salon. Ah! Angelina had been invited to meet the guests at Madame Henriette Julie de Murat's table. The fawning young woman who had delivered the summons must be Henriette Julie's lover. The women's entanglement garnered murmurings of disapproval and speculation where their families were concerned. But at the salons, their intellectual home, they were accepted without question, adored even. Marie-Catherine was impressed when Madame de Murat cut off her conversation to greet Angelina, standing to her full height of almost 5 feet and offering a deep curtsy, indicating to her circle of friends that a fascinating newcomer was in their midst. Madame de Murat was beautiful, though not from any single feature. Arched black brows, small mouth, a pointed chin, and slightly large nose. But because of her irrepressible sense of humour, which belied an intimidating character. Marie-Catherine had certainly admired Madame de Murat's courage in the face of the court scandal that engulfed her family. Indeed, she had gone out of her way to champion the young writer's first collection of fairy tales. Madame de Murat had paid her a priceless compliment in response, nominating Marie-Catherine as the living embodiment of the fairy tale spirit of the age in the foreword to Contes des Fées. But when Marie-Catherine wrote to her, asking her to sign her petition to restore Nicolas Tiquet to freedom, she had been disappointed to receive a polite decline. If I were anyone else, I would not hesitate to support her case. I must admit, too, that Madame Tiquet has not been a contributor to the Society of French Letters, which makes me somewhat less inclined to put my already damaged reputation at risk. But there is another consideration, in all truthfulness. A signature by my hand might attract the wrong sort of attention when viewed by the king, harming rather than serving your good cause. A group of younger guests walked past Marie-Catherine, their laughter cutting through her thoughts.
"I do think she's innocent," said a woman in a yellow dress. "I spoke with her once, and I can tell you she does not have the brains to conceive of such a scheme."
"You've fallen for her innocent face then, like the rest of the fools," a man said. "If you'd heard the stories I have, you wouldn't be so sure of yourself. A deviant."
"You're all beasts,"
said another woman, playfully rapping the man on the knuckles with her fan. "The poor creature is being used to warn the rest of us off murdering our dear husbands. Isn't it obvious?" Marie-Catherine breathed deeply, caught the eye of a servant and instructed him to fill her plate. If only Madame de Noailles had not been occupied. Marguerite never missed Mademoiselle L'Héritier's salons, but had the excuse of a publishing deadline to keep her confined to her private chamber. Her proposal to write a novel, set alternately in Provence and Paris, told as a series of letters, had been accepted by Marie-Catherine's French publisher, Claude Barbin. Although Marguerite was happy to sign her name to Marie-Catherine's petition, she had been perfectly frank in her summation of the wretchedness of Nicola's case. She had advised Marie-Catherine to guard against raising her hopes in the face of almost certain disappointment. The chattering of a parrot caught Marie-Catherine's ear, and she glanced at the ageing poet, Madame de Surat, sitting alone and unaware amidst the animated attendees. Her son delivered her to the several literary salons that operated each week throughout Paris. Madame de Surat no longer wrote and published verses. She seemed content to be left to her own devices, entertained by the performers and the antics of her pet bird. Marie-Catherine fought an image of her future self, a marmoset seated in her lap, perfectly happy to be overlooked for the younger crowd. Attending a salon usually roused her spirits, but she felt a heavy melancholy settling about her shoulders. She determined to resist the temptation to draw its curtains over her face. She was by no means forgotten or excluded. She reminded herself that her daughter had earned these introductions to new friends. She had impressed the city's tastemakers. She considered and then rejected the thought of walking over to support Angelina. It was not Marie-Catherine's custom to circulate amongst salon attendees, partly due to the difficulties of wading about in the press of excited bodies with her cane. She preferred to be approached at her table. Her company sought for discussion and advice. But perhaps tonight she would treat herself to an early night, after all. There would be other opportunities to speak to Madame de Murat, and she had carried out her pledge to Alphonse, helping him along the course of becoming an author. It was surely more than enough. She wondered where the serving boy had disappeared to. She needed her drink refilled. After all, she had not quite reached Madame de Surat's state of guileless self-sufficiency. Noticing Alphonse walking back to their table, freed of his queuing admirers, she exhaled a slow, relieved breath. She had much to talk to him about, particularly the ending of The Clever Deception. Did he realize that he risked exposing his real nature to the gossiping tongues of the close-knit salon society? That this might jeopardize him when it came time to obtain a royal privilege from the censor? Or had she missed something? Was this his intention? You must think of yourself above reproach, having your bard and his mistress express such delight at pulling the proverbial wool over the court's eyes, she remarked when he arrived at the table. Alphonse met her gaze with a small frown. The Clever Deception isn't just a fairy tale. In fact, it's barely a fairy tale. I deliberately refrained from using fantastical elements. I wanted the characters, their intimacies, the testing of their romance to be centre stage, not a carnival of impossible tricks. If that was your desire, then you found success. But you have a reservation, said Alphonse, raising his eyebrow in question. Only that salon audiences are more indulgent and obliging than the reading public. Oh, but I disagree, said Alphonse, nodding at the servant approaching with Marie-Catherine's roast pigeon. There was some confusion, and the meal was placed in front of him instead. Angie's had me reading de Murat and L'Héritier. They're concerned with exploring the inner lives of their characters. He spoke with a degree of seriousness, moving her food around her plate with a fork, as a prop to explain how he had wanted to emphasize the arts of conversation.
Why would he not just eat the blessed thing? She could not accuse him of confusing styles, he protested, because it was the conteurs themselves who invented the art of cobbling tales together from a plethora of forms. Medieval romance, Hellenic fable, bloody history, courtly verse, and so on. She would not press her point. I adored the little portraits you made. They were perfect miniatures, Marie-Catherine conceded. You are mastering the art of telling tales, which is, as you say, to borrow, reinvent, and circulate. Thank you, Baroness, said Alphonse, the tone of his voice almost sarcastic. To her relief, he lifted a bite of succulent-looking pigeon meat to his lips. She could not help offering a final word of advice, begging him to return to the tale's ending one last time. Perhaps I can jiggle a phrase here and there, give the climax double meaning, if you will, he said. So it's traditional enough to cure your doubts, but still recognized by the sensitive reader. Pausing to wipe his mouth, he inquired if there had been word from Cornelius Alberts. She had been dreading the query, but was relieved he had brought it up. I'm afraid not, she replied, adding that her Dutch publisher was a busy man. No doubt an offer would arrive soon. She had brought Alphonse a gift to celebrate his debut. She lifted a small wrapped cloth out of her bag. Inside the material lay a cylinder, enamelled white with gilt silver edges. A hand-painted picture decorated its lid. Jeanne la Pucelle, surrounded by angels. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, our very first femme forte, said Alphonse, smiling in delight. He removed the lid from the case and revealed the contents, a series of nibs, a wax seal, and other instruments that he could use for writing letters. The quill set had been a precious belonging of Marie-Catherine's, given to her by Mademoiselle de Scudéry to celebrate the success of her Spanish novels, and for a moment it felt as if she were passing on more than an elegant writing tool.
Dearest Marie-Catherine,
whispered a woman's voice. She turned, pleased to see that the salon's hostess, her friend Marie-Jeanne L'Héritier, had stopped at her table. Marie-Jeanne, come. I'm eager to hear your thoughts about Monsieur Apéride's performance. Please do take a seat, said Marie-Catherine. Without waiting for a reply, she rushed on. Do you need some refreshment? I must congratulate you on the salon. What a marvellous success! But you must be run off your feet, poor dear.
I'm sorry, Marie-Catherine, Mademoiselle L'Héritier replied with a distracted smile. I'm afraid I do not have the time to chat. I only wanted to borrow your charming companion, Monsieur Apéride. An important personage wishes to make his acquaintance.
By all means, replied Marie-Catherine, masking her disappointment by elaborately waving her hand in Alphonse's direction. At least she would not have to again hear Mademoiselle L'Héritier's good news, passed on in Madame de Noyer's last letter, that her pamphlet defending the reputation of Mademoiselle de Scudéry had found a publisher and was to be made into a book. For years, Mademoiselle L'Héritier had cultivated a friendship with the stately elder writer. When the critic, Monsieur Nicolas Boileau, circulated Satire X, an attack on de Scudéry's Cellier novels, in which he ridiculed her popularity with female readers and transformed the Greek heroines of the books into harpies, ogres, witches, and madwomen, Mademoiselle L'Héritier had inked her quill to write a spirited rebuttal. But while Marie-Catherine wholeheartedly supported the project, her reception of the news had been soured by thoughts of her own pamphlet languishing on her desk. Like Madame de Murat, Mademoiselle L'Héritier had expressed a desire not to be publicly associated with supporting the case of Madame Tiquet,
She had donated funds to help print the pamphlet, but they were delivered with a rebuke about Nicola's conduct. Her relationship with the King's Guard, wrote Mademoiselle L'Héritier in her letter, did not put her in a favourable position at all. Clearly she had been swayed by the newspapers' damning reports of Nicola's trial and sentencing. How could Marie-Catherine imagine Albert's would support her case? His own broadsheet had sowed the most damaging seeds of gossip about Nicola and Montgeorges, and it appeared they had now sprouted and developed buds. Marie-Catherine could understand, if not condone, the stance her friend occupied. Mademoiselle L'Héritier was only a few years older than Madame de Murat, and her career was equally ambitious. Although she was yet to reach the age of 30, already she had published a collection of fairy tales, a work of history, and several novelettes. Like Madame de Murat, she had been born into a high-ranking family. Her father was employed as a historian for the king, her brother was a mathematician, and her sister a poet. She'd had a rare upbringing for a girl, her father tutoring her himself in the classics, romances, and French canon. He had permitted her to live out her wish of not marrying, supporting her in finding a patron, which she had secured, in the modestly well-off Duchesse de Nemours, enabling her to pursue the passions of her mind without interruption. With no burden of children or husband, and with her intellect so severely honed, she would likely not comprehend Nicolas Tiquet's desperation, the cause of all her terrible mistakes. Marie-Catherine needed to stop thinking about the case. Surrendering Alphonse to his new friend, she wished him the best of luck. He caught her glance of warning, and gave a small nod of understanding. With a flutter of foreboding, she watched her protégé make his way to the front of the salon. Mademoiselle L'Héritier towering beside him, her thin elbow tucked into his. Charles Perrault sat close to the performance space, surrounded by important men who had approached him for urgent conversations. "Be confident," she silently instructed. "Be careful." It was the opportunity they had corresponded about, the chance to secure a patron. Monsieur Perrault, the brother of Mademoiselle L'Héritier's father, was the personage upon whom Alphonse had made a deep impression. Alphonse, poised to begin his career as an author, was more vulnerable than the other conteurs. Born female, he aspired to pass in salon society as a man. She bit her lips and closed her eyes, imagining Perrault taking Alphonse under his wing, offering him the opportunities denied to women like herself. His familial relationship to Madame L'Héritier was the reason he deigned to appear at her salon every once in a while. But in general, Charles Perrault did not approve of women who acted and wrote and sang in public. He made an exception for his niece, who, in his eyes, transcended all norms of propriety. He preferred women to keep close to the hearth, tending children and tired husbands. A good woman, he pontificated, kept herself well out of the public's gaze. Had Marie-Catherine been born a man, she might have been elected to the Académie Française and given a state pension, or garnered a rich patron to fund the ink for her quill. Although Perrault had held the position of treasurer of the Académie for many years and undertaken significant reforms during his tenure, allowing women to become members was not a change he had been interested in implementing. If Alphonse cultivated a friendship with the statesman, what doors would be thrown open to him? It was as if they had a fixed bait on a fishing line and dropped it into the river. Although now that their wish seemed to be coming true, Marie-Catherine could not help but observe an irony, could not stifle a thought of being thoroughly cheated. She did not doubt that Alphonse possessed the wherewithal to conduct himself appropriately, but he would be on his own in his quest. He would need to look where he trod his prettily tied shoes. She could not supply him with advice on how to flatter and impress the king's biographer, because they did not move in one another's circles. Angelina, the 17th of June. Complaining of pain in her feet, Marie-Catherine had proposed to leave the salon before the conclusion of the evening's festivities. She seemed surprised when Angelina asked to stay behind. Rather than acknowledging her outstanding performance, Marie-Catherine demanded to know what she had spoken to Madame de Murat about. Hadn't Angelina a thought in her head about her old maman's comfort? She had a splitting pain behind her temples. Angelina apologized, replying that she had already made the acquaintance of the writer, having composed a complimentary letter after reading her biography, Memoirs of the Countess D., and that the conteuse had suggested a proper introduction at the salon. For a moment Angelina considered disclosing that she had asked Madame de Murat about submitting a review of her memoir to Le Mercure Galant. The writer had given her blessing. She could publish anonymously, but suddenly thought the better of the idea. For weeks she had been turning over a notion to share with her mother that Alphonse's revised fairy tale was in great part her own work. But she had an intuition that Marie-Catherine would withhold any compliments about her achievement. Her mother was incapable of considering any topic other than her obsession with the fate of Nicolas Tiquet. "The coach is waiting," urged Marie-Catherine. Her coat was buttoned, her collar turned up.
"Alphonse can see me home," Angelina pleaded. "I shall be safe. I'll go in his carriage. I've received an invitation to attend the Marquis de Lambert's salon next week. The evening is going so well. Aren't you proud of me for leaving my shell? All the times you criticised me for moping about, and here I am, celebrating a success." How could she be expected to turn her back on the most exciting evening of her life so far? To her surprise, Marie-Catherine had acquiesced. She almost felt guilty, but not quite, watching as her mother was helped to the chamber doors by two servants, the small commotion as a chair was arranged to carry her down Mademoiselle l'Héritier's grand staircase. But she reminded herself of the conversation that had taken place with her father several days earlier. She was not to fall back into the habit of assuming her mother had her best interests at heart. For the Baroness, her own fame and reputation and health always took precedence. Angelina was like some gnat that wriggled into the corner of the great author's vision to be absently batted away with a gloved hand. Because her mother had sensed her curtness over the past few days, Angelina had seen it reflected in her tiny frowns, her pauses, and pursed lips. But Marie-Catherine had not asked what might be troubling her. It was as if they were involved in a drawn-out tournament of matching wits, Marie-Catherine determined to be the last to reveal any weakness. Once Angelina had returned to the salon, Mademoiselle l'Héritier and Madame de Murat asked to join Angelina and Alphonse at her mother's vacated table, promising they were in for a treat. Charlotte Rose de la Force was reciting her fairy tale, Parcelinette, as the closing act. Angelina listened in wonder as the two authors discussed the background to the fairy tale, which had a similar plot to Marie-Catherine's The Bluebird, with its heroine banished to a tower by a vengeful fairy. Madame de la Force, who was the same age as Marie-Catherine, was regarded with awe by the burgeoning conteuse for taking a lover many years younger than herself, Monsieur Charles Brieux. Her family had interfered, banishing her to a Benedictine abbey for several years, but she had petitioned her release from the king, who granted permission for her to marry her lover in a secret ceremony. The four huddled together at her mother's former table, their gazes moving between the elegant Madame de la Force
dressed in a blue silk gown with pearl beads around her neck, her pale fingers clutching the small red book from which she read. To her dashing husband, wearing a suit cut from the same fabric. He hung on to her every word, they all agreed.
Madame de la Force should write a novel with herself and her husband as the protagonists, Alphonse said, smiling. Who wouldn't pay to read the secret history of such an eccentric love affair?
Angelina nodded in agreement, as the recital came to an end and the crowd prepared to leave. She was so full of spirit, how could she possibly sleep? Perhaps she would take out her writing quill when she returned home, and make a start on the review of Madame de Murat's memoir. Her mind whirling with ideas, she kissed her new friend's cheeks and made her goodbyes. Alphonse had disappeared for a last-minute conversation with a new admirer, and she savoured the moment to take in the spoils of the evening. Only a few hours ago, she had been intimidated to the point of speechlessness, entering Mademoiselle L'Héritier's chamber. The marble bust of her image mounted on its towering plinth, the portrait of the hostess in fur-trimmed satin, the exquisite place settings, gold-rimmed goblets, and so many different forks and knives, including the tiniest set, intended to probe a wrinkled escargot from its shell. But at the evening's conclusion she felt oddly at ease. She surveyed the spilled wine, the half-eaten collapsing petit four, the discarded note cards, the drips of melted candle wax, a servant writing a tipped chair, its occupant sprawled on the deep red Persian carpet, a flash of pink stockings and ruffled petticoats. She had an idea for a story. It would start here, at the end of a sumptuous evening. Her thoughts were interrupted by a tap on her shoulder. "There's a messenger arrived for Baroness d'Aulnoy," said one of Mademoiselle L'Héritier's maids. Angelina replied that her mother had left for home. Perhaps she could be delivered the note. A porter, his face flushed, hat askew, and hair plastered over his brow, appeared behind the maid and bowed his head. He had run all the way from the church of Saint-Sulpice, he explained. She must forgive his disordered appearance, but the matter was urgent. "Go on," said Angelina, struggling to keep her voice calm. Had one of her sisters had an accident of some kind? Mademoiselle L'Héritier moved close to her side and clutched her hand. She had been lingering to make her farewells.
"Madame Tiquet's death sentence has been upheld," said the church messenger, his face contorted with emotion. "She's to be executed at the Place de Grève on the day after tomorrow."
Mademoiselle L'Héritier's hand slipped from Angelina's and lifted to her heart. "Oh, Nicolas," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the messenger, seemingly unable to meet Angelina's gaze. "What terrible news." Recovering her wits, she turned and whispered to a servant to fetch the service bell. On his return, she held the silver cone high in the air, ringing it without pause until the dispersing guests, half in and half out of their coats and shawls, had ceased moving, fixing her with their full attention. "I wish Marie-Jeanne had not made an announcement," said Angelina, swaying with the movement of the open-topped carriage.
"Did you expect to keep the news to yourself?" replied Alphonse. "All of Paris has been waiting to hear the verdict. Preparations must be made."
"You might sound more sympathetic," said Angelina, resting her head on the leather seat. Lanterns glimmered on the wall fronts of the shops in the coffee-house district they were passing through. With the installation of outdoor lamps, Louis encouraged the citizens of Paris to enjoy a stroll following dinner, an outing to the theatre or music hall, free from fear of attack by unseen assailants. The sky was cloudless, the stars winking faintly overhead, those same tiny glimmers she had glanced up to at St. Anne's. On cloudy evenings, the village surrounding the convent was cast in suffocating blackness, for no managed system enforced the lighting of lanterns to ensure safe passage through its streets. At 7 o'clock, its inhabitants retired to their bedchambers, nursing the pains of a day's work in the fields, their greatest concern that sleep not tarry in its arrival. Angelina adjusted her bodice. She had asked Lise to lace her tightly, but she had eaten with abandon and taken several glasses of wine and liquor. Underlying her request to stay at the salon had been a desire to speak with Alphonse privately, to turn over every little detail of the evening, though it had now been thrown into ruin. "I'm merely being practical," said Alphonse. "Will you be attending?" Angelina covered her face with her hands and closed her eyes. She had not thought that far in advance, had not considered her role as a spectator at Nicola's execution. "Will you?" "I would not miss it for 1,000 livres," said Alphonse. "I find that sentiment revolting. There's no need to be vulgar," said Angelina. "It doesn't suit you." Alphonse folded his arms across his chest. "Be that as it may, it's no help to behave like a child." Angelina squeezed her fingers together and let out a controlled breath. After a while, she asked Alphonse if they might stop the carriage and continue the journey to Marie-Catherine's apartment by foot. She was concerned she might be ill with the carriage's continual bumping and stopping. He argued that they were nearly there, if she could just hold on a little longer. He needed the conveyance to take him home. Had she not forgotten? It wasn't his habit to walk about the streets at night alone. Perhaps he might loosen the laces under her cloak. "I haven't lost all propriety," replied Angelina. She knew she sounded petulant. She glanced at the buildings of the Saint-Germain antique market. "I'm just glad Maman had already left when the messenger arrived. I do not know how I will tell her." "Perhaps it can wait until the morning," suggested Alphonse. "There's nothing to be done about it this evening. She'll be rested then, in a better state to accept the verdict. Did you manage to speak to her about the Baron yet? I'd be interested to know how she defends herself." Angelina sat up, her eyes narrowed. "You should not have said that. It's bad enough you persuaded me to let you meet Papa. Why would you bring that up, and on such a night? I've been trying to forget about it." Alphonse tapped his fingers along the side of the carriage door. He paused before turning to face her. "Have you never wondered why Marie-Catherine's so caught up in the business with Nicolas?" "Not particularly," said Angelina. "At least, not in any nefarious way. Might you speak more clearly?" "She asked me, a month ago, all very hush-hush, if I would act as an ally for Nicolas. Don't you find that queer? It's as if she sees me as a spineless minion, eager to go along with her every suggestion, simply because of her literary standing." Angelina raised her eyebrows in disbelief. "I think the attention you've received this evening has gone to your head. Whatever Maman asked of you, do not forget that you are an outsider. You're acting like everyone else, eager for the next chapter of this drama, only so that you might gossip about it. You don't really care about Nicolas. She's just an entertainment to you. But this is a family matter for me. Do you have any idea how hard Maman has worked to help her case? She's run herself ragged. Unless you intend to visit in the morning to help wipe away her tears and hold smelling salts under her nose, I suggest you keep your opinions private." "Very well," said Alphonse, grimacing in feigned amusement. "I shall bite my tongue and make no further comment. I do not entirely agree with you, but perhaps you're blinded by the matter. I only have your best interests in mind." "As does Marie-Catherine," contended Angelina. I would not be so sure of that, Angie dearest. How long have you been living under her roof? A few months? And where did you reside before then? Who looked after your needs? Certainly your mother knows how to take care of herself, and her dishonourable friend, of course. But do not fool yourself that she is watching out for your future.
Please,
said Angelina, holding up her hand.
Stop talking. You have said enough.
For a moment her mind was utterly empty of a response, but soon enough she found her tongue.
I shall pretend, for our friendship, that I did not hear those comments. I hardly think you are in a position to judge my family. She sent your manuscript to a publisher. How can you be so ungrateful? And what of me? Do not forget that the fairy tale we recited this evening was written by my hand.
I have not forgotten any such thing. But you might remember that I did not ask Marie-Catherine to send my manuscript to Albert's. In fact, I wish she had not. I would do anything to get it back. And you put yourself forward to rewrite my fairy tale. I could have done it without you, believe me. But you and your mother have constantly pushed your own ideas onto my work. They have nothing to do with what I'm interested in writing about, if you must know. In fact, I might as well tell you now. It's as good a time as any.
Tell me what?
Asked Angelina, her arms folded across her chest, her eyebrows raised. I'm hoping to write a book about your mother and her relationship with your father. I have no need of her as a patron, so there you have it. There shall be plenty of fascinating plot for Parisians to read about.
Do whatever you wish, muttered Angelina, turning to look out of the window.
She refused to speak to Alphonse for the remainder of the journey. How could it be that only moments earlier she had been marvelling at how much she adored him, at what a superb pair they made? She had even considered placing her fingers inside the folds of his doublet, reaching over to kiss him with abandon in the open-topped carriage as it tumbled through Paris's streets. Perhaps he was jealous of her own literary talent, of her mother's success. How could he be so insensitive? She was not yet ready to share with Alphonse her own deep confusion about her mother's choices. His harsh words caused her doubts to multiply, infecting her thoughts like a deadly rash, a red welt arising here, a livid pustule beside it. Hastily she wrapped her doubts in denial. Perhaps it was her religious training, but when she contemplated the fate of Madame Tiquet, she felt only pity and horror. Even if Nicola had taken the law into her own hands, conspiring to rid herself of her husband, who was Angelina to pass judgment? She had not been present. She did not know what was concealed in the chambers of Nicola's heart. And equally, who could blame her mother for helping her friend?
Shall we say a prayer together?
Asked Angelina, stroking her mother's hand. Certainly not, whispered Marie-Catherine. Around 6 a.m, a wailing sound had sounded from the floor below Angelina's chamber. She had woken with a thumping heart, for a moment not recognizing the bulky shapes of her writing desk and clothes bureau. It had taken until the early hours for her to properly fall asleep, every movement and creak inside the apartment startling her back to consciousness. She sat up, perspiring inside the sheet, a fist of dread in her stomach, her myriad fears let loose in a galloping stampede. It was not her finest act, but upon returning home, Angelina had immediately retired to her chamber, nurturing a hope that in the morning Sophie, unable to conceal the knowledge of Madame Tiquet's execution from her face, would be the one to deliver the news along with Marie-Catherine's breakfast tray. On entering Marie-Catherine's bedchamber, Angelina had offered to rub ointment into her feet having missed the previous night's application. But her mother flinched, claiming she did not want to be soothed. Across the bed covers lay the morning's newspaper, torn down the middle of an article announcing new details of the case, suppressed until the final verdict of the magistrates had been made public. It seemed that Claude Tiquet and his relative, Monsieur Clément Villemain, had travelled to Versailles to petition the king to grant Nicola a pardon on behalf of her son, Jean-Paul. Claude claimed he was ready to forgive his wife. His own life had been spared. Might his wife's sentence be commuted to life imprisonment? The reputation of the Tiquet family must be considered. The king had inquired why Monsieur Tiquet had left his appeal for clemency to such a late stage in the proceedings. Too late, in fact, for Louis had decided to wash his hands of the affair and would not interfere in the court's ruling. Marie-Catherine drew her mouth into a bitter grimace. "I cannot tell who I'm angrier at, Claude Tiquet or the Church." Angelina studied her mother's profile as she read, her features tense and drawn. She had seen Marie-Catherine through the grief following her secretary's death, the incessant financial arguments with the Baron, her concern about Theresa's childlessness and Deirdre's pregnancies, and Marie-Catherine had always appeared unflinchingly strong. But it was as if her mother had aged an entire decade overnight. She seemed so very reduced, pulled in on herself. Eventually Marie-Catherine pushed the newspaper away and sat glaring at the wall in silence as Angelina read. The remainder of the article brought the political aspects of Madame Tiquet's case into sharp relief. Angelina should not have been at all surprised to learn that the Archbishop had bent the king's ear, warning that no husband in the city would be able to sleep should Louis respond to the many petitions made in Nicola's favour. And yet, reading the words in black and white beggared belief. The anonymous author of the article cited an unnamed source from the High Court, who claimed the Archbishop had conspired to influence the magistrates, succeeding in gaining their confidence. "I cannot believe it. They wish to make an example of her, to all the wives of Paris," said Angelina. "What do you make of the claim that the court received many confessions of women who had made attempts on their husbands' lives?" Marie-Catherine pressed the back of her hand to her cheek, closing her eyes. She drew in a breath. "Hand me that cursed rag." Angelina found the piece of the newspaper relating to spousal homicide and passed it to Marie-Catherine. "It's simply preposterous," her mother spluttered. She began to read aloud. "The volume of such claims has reached epidemic proportions in the city, and no husband is safe. I fear our petition to the Archbishop may have only harmed Nicola's case." "The Archbishop's disdain for women is no secret in the Church. The nuns at St. Anne's often bemoaned it," said Angelina. "Then why did you not speak up when I sought to petition him?" asked Marie-Catherine. "I do not know," said Angelina, shrugging helplessly. "Words seem to fail me when I most need them." Marie-Catherine touched Angelina's shoulder, flicking her wrist to indicate that she needed to move off the bed. Decisively she tossed back the bed covers. Angelina gathered the pieces of the newspaper together and made them into a pile. "If you will excuse me, I have an errand to run. I have to send a package to Papa. I didn't have time yesterday." "I hope you don't intend to deliver it yourself." Marie-Catherine's voice trembled. "I need you here with me." "It will not take long," Angelina said reassuringly. Her heart thumping wildly, she left Marie-Catherine's chamber, rushing down the staircase and into the kitchen. She removed her medical kit from the cupboard, unlacing the tie and unrolling the leather pouch on the preparation table. What a miserable excuse for a daughter she had become. In the commotion of the past several days, the promise she had made to the Baron to send him the preparation Le Chinese had slipped her mind. The directions on the brown bottle were written in such tiny script that she could barely read them. The preparation was strong. The Baron's valet would need to dose him carefully. She recalled the fellow's slow-witted responses and decided she had better write down the instructions for her father to read. In Marie-Catherine's chamber, Sophie was helping her mother with her toilette. She rummaged through the contents of her writing desk for letter paper. She copied out clear directions, adding a note wishing her father well, and then heated a candle to seal it. But there was no wax, and none in the supply cabinet either. Sighing, she put on her travelling cape. She would have to fetch more. A porter could run the errand, but she preferred to do it herself. The supply store was not far, and she knew the remainder of the day would be passed in her mother's gloomy chamber, writing the letters she dictated, so that they might attend Nicola's execution. As the only tree standing in the field of her mother's fury, she was preparing to be lashed by strong winds, vulnerable to a fiery lightning strike. A solitary stroll, for a few lungfuls of fresh air, the sun making the new leaves of the trees shimmer, would help her to face the storm. At the top of the street a procession was taking place. The traffic on Rue du Four halted to allow its passage. A bishop, dressed in white and gold vestments, walked beneath a canopy embroidered in silver and gold thread. His hands clasped a heavy monstrance, its rays wrought in brilliant gold leaf. 4 priests in cassocks surrounded the bishop, supporting the canopy with golden poles. Behind them moved the long tail of the liturgical procession: deacons, monks, a section of nuns and novices, and lastly the laity. She remembered participating in the Corpus Christi parade at St. Anne's. It had been one of her favourite feast days. The celebration of the host's transubstantiation into Christ's flesh, touching her soul with its solemn beauty. The novices were always excited for an excursion into the village, promenading in their white veils and habits along the main street towards the medieval cathedral on the hill. Was it shameful that such fond memories were permanently marred by her lost faith? She paused to watch the passage of believers, her mind crowded with heretical thoughts. Prayer would not bring Henrietta back to life, and neither would prayer stay the violence about to be inflicted on Nicola Tiquet by the kingdom, its entwined arms of church and state. Receiving the Eucharist would not ease her father's physical suffering. Several stragglers hurried by, rushing to catch up with the parade, and it was as if the last vestiges of faith in everlasting life, in the doctrine of Christ's forgiveness, slipped from her forever. She felt nothing, not guilt nor grief. She was simply emptied out. She had best fetch the wax quickly and take herself home. The medicine for the Baron, which would garner him measurable, verifiable relief, must be delivered. Marie-Catherine, the 18th of June. Still wearing her nightgown, Marie-Catherine opened the door to her chamber, that former place of refuge where she had penned fairy tales and best-selling historical novels. Leaning on her cane, she walked towards her writing table and drew out the chair. She sat down painfully, tucking herself in, lit a fresh candle and drew in a breath. The surface was littered with the remnants of the letters and envelopes received in her campaign to have Nicola freed. If she were to work again on her writing, she would need to sort through this debris, filing it away, clearing a physical space so that she might again think. Wearily she began to gather the letters together into a pile. She did not need to read their contents, to feel the cold accusations in their pages. It would be best to get rid of them for good, she decided. The room was chilly. She rubbed her arms and glanced at the fire. There were still a few smouldering coals in the grate. That was what she would do, rekindle the day's fire with the letters as fuel. Yes, she would incinerate the reminders of her Paris acquaintances' unwillingness to fight for a woman who had been the faithful supporter, even if it were only in food and sparkling drinks, of their beloved literary gatherings. Taking herself to the fireplace, the bundle tucked under her arm, she crouched before the grate. As the flames began to lick and grow, she recalled that afternoon of her salon many weeks ago when Nicola had sought her advice. She had visited a fortune-teller who had left her feeling distressed and desperate, and Marie-Catherine had every sympathy for a woman put to shame by her husband. But she feared her suggestion had been misunderstood, taken too far. What had she said to Nicola? She searched her memory. She had told her to look to the future, echoing the soothsayer's prediction. To pretend that Monsieur was invisible, perhaps. She could not recall her precise words. To live as if he could not make trouble for her any more. Nicola had certainly seized an opportunity for herself in resuming her dalliance with Gilbert Montgeorges. Marie-Catherine supposed that, had the plan not fallen apart, it would have made Nicola happier, for a time at least. But the valet had that altercation with Monsieur Tiquet, and the idea of Nicola freeing herself from her miserable marriage, even if only in thought, seemed hopelessly naive. She would never know if the plot to attack Monsieur Tiquet had been the valet's invention or if Nicola had also been involved. She did not wish to think about it. Whatever the case, and only those two knew the truth, Marie-Catherine had played some role and now carried a bundle of guilt. Why had she told Nicola she had the power to change the circumstances of her life? When had such an outcome been possible for a woman of their rank? It had never been her intention to suggest Nicola dispose of her husband. Or had it? Nicola was one of the few people in Paris who knew the full story of Marie-Catherine's marriage. She had confessed her own crimes one evening after they had taken too much brandy. Nicola had been in a horrific fight with Claude, leaving bruises on her neck and scratches on her wrists, and Marie-Catherine had attempted to comfort her with the tale of her own struggles, wanting to make her feel less wretched and alone. Perhaps she also wished to share a secret that was becoming difficult to contain. Had this knowledge hung in the shadows of her friendship with Nicola, awaiting the perfect hour to rear up and strike? She should have known better. She should have kept her own counsel. A knock sounded on the door of the chamber, and she glanced up, fingers sooty from the fire. "Come in," she called. Angelina rushed over to her. She reached out her hand, taking Marie-Catherine by the elbow and helping her to stand.
"What are you doing down there?"
Marie-Catherine explained that she was burning the letters she had been sent from her Parisian connections, who had mostly declined to help Nicola. She had decided to clear the air. How could she be expected to resume writing when they cluttered up her desk, a constant reminder?
"I think I have a way we can help, Nicola,"
said Angelina. Marie-Catherine shook her head wearily. She gave her daughter a thin smile. "That time has passed, daughter." Angelina shook her head vigorously. A piece of her long brown hair had fallen out of her head wrap.
"Listen to me a moment. I shall explain everything," she said. "You may find it rather shocking, I know it, but if you truly love Nicola, then you'll take the chance."
Their messenger had been sent to the Baron's residence,
and would not be back for an hour. Marie-Catherine must travel now in person to visit with Father Etienne to discuss their plan. When asked why she would not make the journey herself, Angelina expressed frustration. It was Marie-Catherine who held sway with the priest, not Angelina. The idea had come to her on her walk. She had not seen Father Etienne in the Corpus Christi parade, so it was likely he was readying himself to attend Nicola at the Grand Châtelet the following day. Angelina had too much else to prepare, but she might take Lise to assist her. Angelina's maid had already expressed her willingness to help. Could she not see it was the only way? Marie-Catherine had the carriage stop at the back entrance to the cathedral, leaning heavily on Lise, and one of the footmen, to make the short journey to the seat beneath the elm trees. She removed her gloves and rubbed her fingers. The day was warming up. In the noon sun, the cemetery seemed almost like a garden. Father Etienne's rose bushes weighted with rich, velvety blooms. Were her joints not seized and crippled, she would have stooped before the gravestones to deliver kisses to her children's names. Lise was taking her time fetching the priest, so Marie-Catherine had the opportunity to fully examine the implications of Angelina's plot, which she had agreed to rather impulsively. It provided an object about which her mind's tremulous deliberations might be organised, much in the manner that a physician's emetic redistributed the pains from her toes to her bowels. If only she could get up and pace about. Instead, she sat rooted to the bench, unable to move. A crawling sensation on her sensitive fingers was a trail of ants, unaware of her intrusion, collectively treating her as a log or a branch fallen across their path. Soon she was caught up imagining her feet and legs, her hands and arms, slowly transforming into wood and bark. She was no more a woman waiting to take part in an urgent conversation, but a part of the garden, the claws of a jay in her hair, its bill digging into her scalp as it fussed about weaving sticks to make its nest. A sound of laughter, and there was Lise, walking closely beside Father Etienne, turning her pretty head to look up at him. Marie-Catherine was reminded of his visit to the brothel and steeled her resolve. The priest expressed his condolences, and she brushed them away. From her bag, she removed the veil Matthias Carlier had sent for Nicola to wear to her execution. The letters he had written for Marie-Catherine to pass on. To her immense relief, Father Etienne confirmed that he would be acting as Nicola's priest. The bishop's thankful I'm stepping in on his behalf. He talks in flourishing sermons, but when it comes to consoling a condemned prisoner, he's not quite able to muster our Lord's strength. Taking her fingers in his, as if in preparation for his duties the following day, he inquired if she had anything else for him to deliver to Nicola. She allowed him to hold her hands, even though he squeezed them too tightly for her comfort. Drawing in a breath, her eyes downcast, she spoke her blasphemous request. She could not watch the priest's expression change as she explained herself. While I have every respect for the religious conversion you profess Nicola has made, she said, and that the prayers you will offer tomorrow will take care of her soul, I fear it's not nearly enough. Your parishioner and my dear friend is to be tortured. Please, I am willing to beg, she implored. Will you help us? It would be a mortal sin, replied Father Etienne, dropping her hands and moving away from her. He sat back against the bench, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes. It would not be your first, countered Marie-Catherine, her voice grave. We're not asking you to perform black magic. I am not a witch. Father Etienne wrung his fingers through his grey hair. He glanced at her face, a tide of secrets washing behind his eyes. But she saw through the murky water, all the way down to the floor of that river, the slimy-skinned eels winding through the reeds, the mossy barnacled timbers of a sunken boat, the silver wriggling flash of a school of fish. If you are unwilling on my behalf, and on behalf of your parishioner, then might you consider it as a favour to Angelina? She's tormented by the verdict. Put yourself in her shoes. Marie-Catherine knew immediately that she had touched a nerve, though she had no choice but to apply further pressure. She reminded Father Etienne of Angelina's troubles at St. Anne's, explained how the suicide of her friend had almost caused her to turn her back on God. He had promised to help them, and look what had happened. The Catholic Church had all but signed Nicola's death warrant. Assisting them to carry out their plan was the least he could do. Marie-Catherine lowered her eyes again. She would count to 100, awaiting his response. If he still needed convincing, she was prepared again to raise the matter of his visiting the brothel. It felt as if she had stumbled into a war between men and women, and she was merely girding herself for the next battle. The more Father Etienne resisted, the faster the blood in her heart pumped, her determination to convince him as deadly as any strike from a sword. She sensed the bounds of reason loosen. She could see how outlandish her proposal was, and yet she could not change course on the campaign to have her demands met, even if it meant reminding the priest of his failures, humiliating him through and through. "I just told Father Etienne I am no witch, but perhaps I lied," commented Marie-Catherine. Angelina stood at the kitchen table, dressed in a maid's skirt and blouse, an apron tied at her waist. Her medical kit lay open, and she had been pounding herbs. "What did he say?" she replied, tracing a finger over the text of one of the medical manuals she had borrowed from the priest. Marie-Catherine removed a little brass box, in the shape of a seashell, from the pocket-bag tied to her belt, and placed it on the page her daughter was reading. "Well done, Maman," Angelina whispered, flipping open the catch and checking the contents. "It's perfect." Marie-Catherine inquired if any messages had been delivered in her absence, and Angelina pointed to a small pile of envelopes on the table. "Is it difficult to prepare?" "Not at all," said Angelina, glancing at her, watching as she opened the first envelope. "I read several formulae to check on the dosage, but the apothecary's preparation is ready for use. No wonder the tincture's so expensive. It has powdered ambergris, gold and pearl mixed into it, and a lot of brandy." Marie-Catherine nodded, her lips pressed together in concentration. Deirdre had written that there were several seats available if they wished to watch the execution together. They would be viewing it from an apartment belonging to a friend of Pierre's that overlooked the Place de Grève, where the scaffold was to be erected. There had been an explosion of demand to hire such places, and the owners were asking as much as 10 pistoles for a viewing spot, more than their quarterly rents. They would have to let Deirdre know immediately. She had been inundated with requests, and the positions were filling quickly. "I'm glad to help Nicola, of course, but I must say I think she was a fool to attempt such a thing," said Angelina, eyes on her work, as though she would not be found out. Marie-Catherine put the letter on the table. "What on earth do you mean?" "Come, Maman. She has every motive, and there are witnesses. You do not truly think her innocent of the crime, surely?" "Of course I do. What do you imagine I've been doing these weeks in rushing around and trying to have her freed? Speculating like this is beneath you. I raised you to know better." Angelina made a sound from deep inside her throat. Was she scoffing? She did not look away from her task. "Perhaps you were masking your own guilt,
trying to make it go away, like your other mistakes.
Mary Katrine drew a chair out from the table and sat down, her legs weak. If you think for a moment I had anything to do with the attack on Claude Tiquet, well, what? Demanded Angelina in a low voice. You'll send me back to St. Anne's? She wiped her hand on her apron. Well, Maman, I have news for you. I won't be going. Her daughter stood glaring at her, her arms spread apart, her knuckles tightened into fists and pressed against the table surface. She was breathing heavily. After this? Said Mary Katrine, sweeping her hands to indicate Angelina's medical equipment. She offered a small smile. Perhaps with levity she could reach her daughter. Angelina's defensive posture relaxed. She looked away. I didn't really think you were involved. Alphonse suggested it to me because you asked him to assist with Nicola's case. Mary Katrine recoiled. The conniving little beast. He should keep to writing fairy tales, she muttered. From an outsider's viewpoint, perhaps her immense concern about Nicola's predicament seemed a little unusual, but she had been carrying out her duty as a friend. Angelina recovered her composure. She asked Mary Katrine to not think poorly of Alphonse. It's a natural conclusion to draw, and he's not the only one, I imagine, given what you did to Papa. What I did to your Papa? Mary Katrine gave a shrill laugh. Please tell me what new crimes he claims I've committed against him. It's an old one, Maman, which has been kept secret from me. His incarceration in the Bastille. There was a heavy silence. Have you finished the preparation? Asked Mary Katrine, her voice brusque. Almost, replied Angelina. Have the courier deliver it to Father Etienne, and then join me in my chamber. We have letters to write. Angelina nodded meekly. Her face was flushed. Her hands trembled as she folded away her medicine kit.
This ends CD 9.